the smoke comes first. Not from fire, but from chimneys, hundreds of them rising above a city that never truly sleeps. Then comes the sound: iron wheels, horse hooves, the endless ticking of clocks that measure progress in soot and sweat. Beneath the gaslight, men in top hats hurry through fog thick enough to drown in. The empire hums proud, vast, and hollow at its core. It is the Victorian era, the century that built the world we still live in, where invention shone brighter than conscience and wealth climbed on the shoulders of the unseen. The same steam that powered locomotives also choked the lungs of factory children. The same empire that ruled the seas could not rule its own hunger for more. And through it all, the city pulsed alive, diseased, magnificent. They said it was progress. They said it was destiny. But progress has a price, and destiny always comes collecting. The gears still turn, long after the hands that built them have turned to dust. So, tonight, let the fog settle and the clocks slow down. Listen to the hum of the past as it seeps through the cracks of the present. This is where the modern world began, in the smoke, the silence, and the fever of the Victorian age. Subscribe and stay with me. There are more empires to unearth, more lives caught in the gears, and more nights that never end. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? The morning does not rise in London, it leaks. From chimneys and river mouths, from the throats of steam engines and the cracks of cobblestones. The city exhales before it wakes. The air itself feels alive, thick with soot and breath, pressing against the skin like damp wool. Beneath the fog, footsteps echo on the bridge, the slow march of men who carry the weight of an empire on their backs without ever touching its crown. Somewhere below, the Thames moves sluggishly, black as oil. Its surface glints with the faint shimmer of gaslight reflecting off the water. Trembling kind of beauty, the sort that only exists in ruin. Barges groan beneath their loads, ferrying coal, timber, and refuse in equal measure. Every wave that laps against the banks seems to whisper the same truth. Everything that feeds this city also poisons it. In the narrow lanes near the docks, children with smudged faces huddle around the heat of a baker's vent. Their breaths form small clouds that vanish as quickly as they appear. Above them, laundry hangs like surrender flags between windows streaked with soot. The smell of horse dung, coal smoke, and cheap gin drifts through the alleys, a scent that clings to life itself. London does not smell like a city. It smells like survival. And yet there is glory here. In the heart of the fog, carriage wheels flash under gaslight. Polished boots stride through marble halls, and orchestras tune beneath chandeliers, heavy with crystal. Somewhere in the West End, a ball begins, and the laughter of the wealthy rises above the hum of the streets below. The poor will never hear it, but they will feel its echo in the price of bread, in the hours stolen by factory bells, in the hunger that keeps the gears of the city turning. By the time dawn reaches Buckingham Palace, the Queen's City is already awake. Trains hiss in the distance. Newspapers slap against doorsteps with headlines that promise progress, discovery, empire. The word modern hangs in the air like a benediction, though few yet understand what it will cost. In these years, London becomes something new, not a city, but a machine made of flesh and iron. Its heartbeat is the railway. Its lungs are the factories. Its voice is the hiss of steam that never stops. From the poorest rookery in Whitechapel to the glowing windows of Westminster, everything hums with the same fever, the belief that the future can be built with smoke and willpower alone. The Victorians call it progress. Others, watching from the alleys, call it madness. But even they can't look away from the light. The fog thickens as the day grows. Church bells toll through the haze, each note fading into the endless hum of industry. Somewhere, a child coughs. Somewhere else, a new factory opens. The river keeps moving, slow and patient, carrying everything hope, ash, and empire toward the waiting sea. The Victorian age has begun, and the world will never breathe the same again. The crown was too heavy for her, not in gold, but in silence. It gleamed on a head barely grown into womanhood, a circlet of duty pressed upon the dreams of an 18-year-old girl who still blushed when spoken to. The dawn of June the 20th, 1837, crept pale and unkind through the windows of Kensington Palace. Outside, London stirred beneath its smoke. Inside, the air was still, suspended between one heartbeat and the next. Victoria had been roused before the sun. Her governess whispered that the king was dead, that the messengers had come. She stood barefoot on the rug, wrapped in a dressing gown, her hair unpinned, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that feels like awakening. In the antechamber, the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Lord Chamberlain bowed low before her. For a moment she hesitated, then said, almost to herself, "I am the Queen." It was not triumph she felt, but the weight of inheritance. An empire that spanned continents now rested in the hands of a girl who had never crossed the sea. Outside, the city was already whispering her name, Victoria, die junge Königin, with curiosity, with awe, with doubt. Across the world, colonial officers straightened their uniforms, soldiers raised their flags, and the hum of Britain quickened like a pulse. The palace filled quickly with voices. Courtiers swept in, papers rustled, the scent of candle wax and ink mingled with the damp air of the morning. Victoria's mother stood at the edge of the room, her face pale and unreadable. The girl who had always been kept under watch was suddenly untouchable. Even her own mother would need permission now to see her. When the news reached the streets, London answered not with bells, but with noise carriage wheels, the bark of newsboys, the cheer of strangers who wanted to believe that youth could mean renewal. In the taverns, men raised their mugs to her name. In the drawing rooms, women imagined a reign of gentleness, of beauty, of peace. But history rarely grants its promises so kindly. In the weeks that followed, she learned what it meant to be visible yet unseen. Ministers lined up to lecture her. The Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, became her guide, her anchor in the sea of politics. He was grey-haired, charming, and shrewd, a fatherly presence in a world that demanded perfection from its sovereign and purity from its woman. Under his counsel, the young queen began to harden, learning when to smile, when to silence herself, when to yield and when to command. By the end of her first year, she no longer trembled when she entered the Privy Council. The girl in the white gown had become a symbol, one that the empire could project upon. Virtue, stability, destiny. Yet behind the symbol, the real woman kept a diary. In its pages, her hand shook as she wrote of loneliness, of exhaustion, of nights when the corridors echoed too loudly. The diary was her rebellion, her one quiet truth. Beyond the palace gates, London kept growing new factories, new inventions, new maps colored red for conquest. She ruled a world she barely understood, and the world loved her for it. The young queen stood at the edge of the century, both its child and its architect, and somewhere beneath the gaslight glow of the city, a voice seemed to whisper, "The girl has become the age itself." The morning no longer belonged to the birds, it belonged to the whistle. The shrill cry of iron cutting through fog replaced the song of dawn as the new sound of England. Across the fields, engines hissed in the chill, white breath rising from their flanks like creatures alive and restless. Steam blurred the line between heaven and earth, between past and future. The old world was being boiled away. The first trains came like rumors, small, uncertain, rattling across a countryside that did not yet know whether to marvel or to fear. Farmers stopped their plows and stared. Children ran toward the smoke as though chasing a dragon. Horses reared at the shriek of the whistle, and clergymen warned from their pulpits that such speed defied the will of God. But the iron beast did not stop. Every mile of track was a declaration that time itself could be conquered, that the world could be made smaller by force of will and steam. At Euston Station, the air was a fog of oil, sweat, and triumph. Men, in soot-stained coats, swung hammers until their palms blistered. Engineers spoke in the language of progress, pistons, gauges, pressure, velocity, words that sounded almost holy in their certainty. And when the engines rolled forward, their wheels biting into the rails, the crowd cheered as if watching the birth of a new element. In the years that followed, the map of Britain changed shape. Railways sliced through villages, forests and moors. Bridges rose over valleys. Tunnels bit through mountains. The countryside that had once taken days to cross could now be traversed in hours. Farmers became commuters. Merchants became travelers. And news for the first time in history began to move faster than the wind. The country's pulse quickened, and the rhythm of life fell in step with the timetable. But progress always leaves ghosts behind. Where once there were quiet lanes and hedgerows, now came smoke and noise. The fields near the tracks turned grey from soot, the cattle skittish at the roar of the passing trains. In the slums of London and Manchester, families who had once lived by the rhythm of the harvest now worked to the rhythm of the machine. The whistle that promised freedom also commanded obedience. Still, there was wonder. Lovers said farewell on platforms veiled in steam. Children pressed their faces to the glass as the world blurred past. To ride a train was to move faster than thought to feel, for a few minutes, like a god chasing the horizon. And at the heart of it all stood the station's cathedrals of progress, their arches rising like prayers in iron and glass. The Victorians believed the railway would unite the nation, and it did, but it also bound it in chains of expectation. The train demanded punctuality, efficiency, and precision. It made time measurable, and in doing so, it made time unforgiving. By the 1840s, the age of steam had become more than machinery, it was a religion. Its hymns were whistles, its priests wore soot, and its altars were built from steel. The land that had once woken to the sound of roosters now woke to engines. The empire's veins had opened, and through them ran not blood, but steam. And as the sun set over the iron tracks, glowing like molten wire beneath the sky, no one yet knew that the same engines that connected the world would one day drive it toward exhaustion, that every whistle of progress carried, faintly, the echo of its cost. It began with glass, sheets of it vast, gleaming, and fragile as the dream they were meant to hold. In the spring of 1851, a forest of iron ribs rose from the grass of Hyde Park, and under it, London built a palace for the future. They called it the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of all nations, but to those who saw it for the first time, it was simply miracle. The Crystal Palace shimmered in the pale light like something half alive. From a distance, it looked like the skeleton of a giant creature, a cathedral made not for God, but for invention. Its glass panes caught the clouds and turned them to silver. Its arches stretched toward heaven, as though challenging it. Inside, under acres of glittering roof, the empire gathered itself machines, fabrics, clocks, jewels, engines, weapons, the trophies of a world convinced it had mastered creation. The air smelled of oil and perfume, of newness and dust. Visitors moved through the galleries in murmuring wonder, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. There were mirrors from Venice, telegraphs from America, and silk from China. There were models of locomotives, printing presses, and mechanical looms that seemed to breathe as they moved. Every nation had sent something an offering to the altar of progress, and at the center of it all, beneath the canopy of glass and sunlight, stood the British Empire itself, smiling, confident, and blind to its own reflection. Princes and paupers walked side by side, all dazzled by the spectacle. For 6 months, London became the heart of the world. 500,000 visitors poured through its doors, from dukes in waistcoats to farmers still smelling faintly of hay. They gazed upward and whispered that the future had arrived, that man's ingenuity was endless. But even inside the glass palace, shadows gathered. Outside its shining walls, the city still coughed and starved. The same year that London displayed its wealth, the poor of Ireland buried their dead in fields of hunger. The same railways that brought visitors to Hyde Park also carried children to factories where they labored through the night. Progress gleamed, but its light came from fire. On summer afternoons, the palace became an oven of light. The glass trapped the heat, and visitors wiped their brows while the plants in the great central court withered in their pots. Yet no one wanted to leave. The building was too beautiful to question, too impossible to doubt. Even when the sunlight fractured into blinding shards that cut across the air like knives, they called it divine. When the exhibition closed, the Crystal Palace was dismantled and moved to the south, its frame reassembled piece by piece, like a memory trying to keep itself alive. There it stood for decades, until fire finally consumed it. Some said they saw the flames rise through the glass like the last breath of the century itself. What had begun as a celebration of progress ended as a fire prophecy. The Victorians had built a cathedral to their own reflection, and when it burned, it was as if the age had caught a glimpse of its soul, bright, ambitious, and fragile beyond repair. The glass had held the future once. Now the smoke held its ghost. The rain doesn't fall in London, it seeps. It creeps down brick and iron, slips between the cracks of cobblestones, and pools in the hollows where the forgotten sleep. Beneath the palaces and marble colonnades, another city breathes damp, hungry, invisible. Its air is heavier, thick with coal dust, sweat, and the faint sweetness of decay. Here, light never reaches. Here, the empire's shadow takes human form. In the narrow lanes of St. Giles and Whitechapel, dawn comes not with sunlight, but with the sound of coughing. The streets wake in chorus, babies crying, boots scraping, the groan of cartwheels over puddles. The smell of the night lingers, cheap gin, smoke, refuse. Windows are cracked, paper stuffed against the wind. Rats scurry along the gutters, their eyes catching what little light the day offers. Above, laundry hangs like pale flags of surrender. Families crowd into single rooms, 5, sometimes 10, breathing the same sour air. Mothers boil cabbage over a flame no bigger than a candle. Fathers, if they are lucky enough to work, return at dusk with blackened hands and hollow eyes. The rent man still comes. The landlord's ledger never sleeps. A few pennies short, and everything, every rag, every scrap of bedding is thrown into the street. The neighbors watch, but they do not help. They can't. The workhouse waits for those who fall. The city speaks through its contrasts. A mile west, carriages glide through Mayfair under the soft glow of gaslight. Men in silk waistcoats step from their clubs, perfumed and laughing, the smell of port clinging to them. In drawing rooms bright as mirrors, ladies talk of charity and virtue, their jewels glimmering like constellations above a world they will never touch. They read about poverty in serialized novels, weep over fictional orphans, and send coins in envelopes to societies that promise to help the poor, help themselves. But no one can escape the truth that seeps upward, that every palace leans on the sweat of 100 sellers. The dresses are sewn by fingers cracked and bleeding. The carriages roll on wheels made by men who have never ridden in one. The gold glitters because someone else has gone blind polishing it. At night, the streets grow restless. Gin shops glow like wounds in the dark. Women stand beneath gas lamps, their laughter brittle, their eyes older than their years. Children sleep in doorways wrapped in newspapers, their dreams damp with rain. The constables pass by, pretending not to see. Sometimes they stop not to help, but to move them along. Life in the alleys is a crime by itself, and yet, in all that hunger, there is still defiance, a stubborn kind of grace. A mother humming over a single crust of bread, a boy polishing boots for a coin and giving half to his sister, a fire kept alive with scraps of wood and faith. The poor do not own much, but they own the right to endure. Above them, the city glitters, unaware. Chandeliers tremble with laughter as orchestras play, while below, the same notes drift down through the cracks and fade into the fog. The poor have no music but the rhythm of survival. This was the true foundation of Victorian London, not marble, not empire, but the ceaseless, aching heartbeat of the forgotten. The streets may have been paved with progress, but they were soaked through with the price of it. It begins before dawn. A low clang in the dark, slow, deliberate, merciless. The sound cuts through the fog like a blade. It's the factory bell, and in the grey hours before sunrise, it rules all things. The first note drags men from their beds, the second pulls mothers from their children, the third sends the city itself into motion. No clock is louder than that bell. It tolls for the age of labour and for the bodies it will consume. In the red brick mills of Manchester and Birmingham, light doesn't come from the sky but from furnaces. The air trembles with the hum of machines spinning frames, power looms, pistons pumping in unison. The rhythm is hypnotic, endless, precise. A worker who loses pace loses pay, and a moment's distraction could mean the loss of a hand, an arm, a life. Yet no one speaks. There is only the hiss of steam and the thudding pulse of the age. Children work among the grown, small enough to crawl between machines where adults cannot reach. There, fingers move fast, nimble with fear. Their hair catches the soot, their lungs fill with dust. They are paid a fraction, but their wages keep families alive, or at least alive enough to return tomorrow. Some are no older than 9, but already their backs are bent, their eyes dulled. Childhood has been turned into currency. At noon, the bell rings again, not for rest, but for ration. Tin pails open, bread, cold tea, sometimes nothing at all. The foreman walks the aisles with a stick, tapping the floorboards like a warning. Conversation is forbidden. Laughter is costly. The machines drown out everything anyway. They eat sound, thought, and time. By evening, the sky above the city glows orange with smoke. The workers spill out into the streets, their faces grey, their bodies slick with sweat. The river that runs behind the mills is thick as tar, churning with waste. The women wash their hands in it because there's nowhere else to go. The children play near it, their laughter faint, beneath the roar of another shift beginning. The bell rings again, summoning the next army. Some call this progress. The newspapers say the nation's heart beats stronger now, that industry is the miracle of the century. Politicians boast that Britain leads the world, that her people are fed by work. But in the taverns, men cough into rags black with soot, and in the slums, mothers count coins that never add up to rent. Progress shines brightest when seen from far away. Up close, it burns. Still, there is pride, quiet, bitter, enduring. The factory men talk of endurance like it's a virtue. They build engines they will never own, sew garments they will never wear, and power a world that rarely says their names. But without them, the empire stops. Without their hands, the miracle dies. And so, when the final bell tolls at dusk, no one listens for silence. There isn't any. The city keeps breathing through the night, its factories glowing like furnaces behind the fog, reminders that every dawn in the Victorian age begins not with prayer, but with the clang of the factory bell. The fire never sleeps. It eats the hills, the lungs, the light itself, and the world above depends on its hunger. Beneath the green fields of northern England, in tunnels so low a man must crawl, the miners begin their descent. Lamps swing dimly from their caps, casting trembling halos against walls slick with damp. The air grows close, the sound of shovels echoing like the heartbeat of something ancient and buried. Down here, daylight is a rumour. The coal seam glistens like black glass when struck. It cracks with a sound like bone breaking. Pickaxes rise and fall in rhythm, the only music the age of industry truly understands. The men work by instinct, swing, breathe, haul, cough. Their bodies are coated in soot, their eyes ringed white like masks. Sweat mixes with dust until every face looks carved from ash. The youngest of them, boys barely into their teens, crawl through narrow passages with baskets strapped to their backs. They drag the earth itself toward the surface, inch by inch. Above ground, the city waits for what they bring. Coal fires the trains, the ships, the factories, the kitchens of the rich. It turns water to steam, steam to power, and power to empire. Every puff of smoke that curls above London's rooftops carries the breath of a miner miles away. Without the pits, the great engines of progress would fall silent. The Victorians call coal the black diamond, the treasure that keeps the sun burning through their winters. But it is a sun that devours. When a mine collapses, it happens without warning, a moan of earth, a sudden darkness. There are no sirens, only shouts, muffled by stone. The survivors dig with bare hands until their nails split, trying to reach voices that fade too quickly. When they surface, blinking into daylight, they say nothing. The next day, they go back down. The world above demands its fire. In the mining towns, life moves to the rhythm of the pit. Women scrub coal dust from their husbands' clothes, though it never truly leaves. It seeps into skin, into breath, into the walls of every home. Children grow up tracing maps of the veins beneath their feet, learning early that the only way out is down. Sunday is the one day the bell doesn't ring, and the men gather in churches still blackened from the week's smoke. Their prayers are quiet, but their faith is loud in its endurance. Far away in London, gentlemen discuss the labour question. They debate the worth of a man who earns a shilling for 12 hours beneath the earth. They write essays about progress while their fires burn bright through the night. The distance between the pit and the parlour grows with every ton mined. By the late century, the landscape itself had changed. The hills once green were now scarred, the rivers choked, the sky a permanent dusk. But no one dared call it ruin, they called it prosperity. They said the nation glowed because of the coal, and perhaps it did. The furnaces roared, the trains thundered, the empire blazed across maps. But when the fires dimmed, the truth remained. The sun that powered the world was not golden, but black, and it was fed by men who rarely saw the light it made. The drawing rooms of London had begun to hum, not with gossip or waltzes, but with the quiet thrill of invention, a different kind of intoxication. The men who gathered there were not soldiers or poets, but engineers, chemists, tinkerers, dreamers. Their names filled the newspapers beside the words progress and miracle. They wore fine waistcoats and ink-stained fingers, and in their eyes burned the steady light of obsession. On certain evenings, under the glow of chandeliers, they would unveil their creations to polite applause, strange brass contraptions that whirred, ticked, and spun with life of their own. Small models of engines puffing miniature clouds of steam, telegraph wires that could carry messages faster than a horse could gallop, electric lamps that glimmered like bottled dawn. Ladies fanned themselves and smiled, but the men leaned closer, whispering calculations under their breath. For them, beauty no longer belonged to art, but to precision. The industrial age had created a new kind of nobility, not born of blood, but of invention. James Watt, George Stephenson, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Their names carried the weight of legend. They were builders of bridges that spanned impossible distances, tunnels that pierced mountains, and ships so vast they seemed carved for gods. They spoke of iron as sculptors once spoke of marble. Where others saw soot and noise, they saw the poetry of progress. But their triumphs were not born in palaces. They began in workshops where the air was thick with oil and sparks, where apprentices hammered through the night by candlelight. Ideas were tested in bursts of fire and smoke. Failure was constant, success fleeting. A single miscalculation could bring a bridge down into the river or send a boiler exploding into shrapnel. Yet they continued, driven by something larger than ambition, a belief that to invent was to defy the limitations of being human. As the machines multiplied, so did their masters. Across the country, factories filled with the hum of gears and belts, the rhythm of progress measured in revolutions per minute. The age was no longer content to wait for miracles, it manufactured them. Newspapers wrote of new patents, as if reporting royal births. Steam became the language of power, steel, its grammar. And yet, in the midst of all this brilliance, something changed in the rhythm of life itself. The quiet of the countryside began to vanish beneath the shriek of locomotives. The The sound of water wheels and windmills, once the pulse of rural time, was drowned out by the roar of engines. The world no longer turned with the seasons, it turned with the machines. In London, the gentlemen inventors toasted one another's genius with crystal glasses, the reflection of their lamps gleaming on the rims. They spoke of empire, of the future, of destiny forged in iron, but beneath the applause lay a murmur, a fear whispered in mechanical tones. For if machines could build faster, move farther, and think with precision, what would become of the men who built them? Outside their windows, the city churned a vast engine of its own making. The poor shoveled coal into furnaces they would never see extinguished. The wealthy watched the smoke rise and called it progress. The gentlemen smiled at their machines, proud, unaware that they had not merely created engines. They had created time itself, a time that would soon no longer belong to them. It began with a question that no one had thought to ask before. What time is it exactly? In the centuries before, time had been local, almost personal. A church bell tolled when the priest said it should. A farmer's day began when the light touched the fields. Noon in Manchester might come 7 minutes after noon in London, and no one minded because the world moved slowly enough for difference to be forgiven. But the railway changed everything. Trains did not wait for bells or sunlight. They demanded precision. They demanded obedience. By the 1840s, engines were crossing the countryside faster than sound could travel. One missed minute could mean a collision. Schedules needed order, and so men in waistcoats and pocket watches met in rooms thick with pipe smoke to redraw the rhythm of the world. They called it railway time. Every station would now follow London. Every clock, every town, every worker would bow to the same invisible pulse. The first experiment came quietly. In November 1847, the Great Western Railway synchronized its clocks to Greenwich Mean Time, the time kept by the Royal Observatory on a hill overlooking the Thames. At first, few noticed, but by the end of the decade, almost every rail company had followed. By the 1850s, all of Britain moved to a single heartbeat. Local noon was dead. The world had acquired its first empire of seconds. In the streets, the change was subtle but profound. Clockmakers' shops flourished. Men carried time in their pockets like a secret weapon. The poor, who could not afford watches, listened for the whistles and bells that marked each shift, each curfew, each closing gate. The sound of time had replaced its silence. The bell that once called people to prayer now called them to work. Inside factories, foremen tapped their watches like scripture. In offices, clerks filled ledgers in neat hourly columns. Even the light seemed different, a measured thing, parceled into shifts and deadlines. Time was no longer a tide but a chain, and every link gleamed with precision. At Greenwich, the observatory became the cathedral of the new age. There, astronomers charted the heavens to keep the clocks perfect. The line that ran through the observatory's courtyard, the prime meridian divided east from west, present from past. Tourists came to stand on it, one foot in yesterday, one in tomorrow. They did not know it yet, but they were standing on the seam of modernity. Beyond Britain, the pulse spread. Telegraph wires carried the seconds across oceans. Ships set their chronometers to Greenwich before leaving port, and colonies adjusted their days to match the mother country's ticking heart. The empire now spanned not just land, but time itself, and in homes across London, people began to notice something strange. The sky at dusk no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the timetable. The trains arrived, the lamps were lit, and the world moved in, step to an unseen rhythm. The Victorians believed they had mastered time, but as the century wore on, time began to master them. Every life, every breath, every ambition would now be measured in hours, a mercy to the machines, and a quiet theft from the soul. The map was never still. Every year, new lines appeared across parchment and atlas, red veins stretching farther into the unknown. From London's smoky heart, the British Empire spread like ink through water, colouring continents in the hue of command. What had once been trade became dominion, and what had begun as exploration hardened into rule. In drawing rooms and war offices, men in tailored coats bent over maps lit by candlelight. They spoke softly, as though the world were a ledger to be balanced. A ruler's edge drew straight borders through deserts, jungles, and rivers they had never seen. To them, the earth was a puzzle awaiting order, and they were the ones chosen to solve it. In faraway ports, new names replaced old ones. Bombay, Calcutta, Cape Town cities rebranded, rewritten, reborn under empire. The engines of expansion moved on two rails: commerce and faith. Ships left the Thames heavy with cloth, guns, and Bibles. They returned laden with tea, cotton, sugar, and the silence of millions who had been turned into labor. Steam powered the journey, and the telegraph carried the orders home. It took only minutes for London to whisper across oceans, and weeks for nations to bow. But not all conquests were fought with cannons. Some came draped in silk and ceremony treaties signed under duress. Kings turned into puppets, traditions rewritten beneath the gaze of missionaries. Empire was a theatre, and the Victorians played their roles well. The Queen became not just a monarch, but a myth, Empress of India, mother to a world that had not asked for her. Her portrait hung in places she would never see, her face a currency of loyalty and fear. In the streets of London, the empire was invisible and everywhere. The air smelled faintly of its spoils: tobacco from Virginia, coffee from Ceylon, spices from Zanzibar. The docks groaned under the weight of its riches, while in the East End, laborers unloaded crates, stamped with names they could not pronounce. They had built an empire without leaving home. Yet for all its grandeur, the empire's pulse was restless. Beneath the ceremonies and censuses, rebellion simmered. In India, whispers grew into mutiny. In Africa, treaties turned to chains. Every mile of railway laid across foreign soil carried the weight of resentment. But London did not listen. It heard only the hum of its own success, the sound of ships returning full. Artists painted it as destiny, poets as divine. Schoolchildren learned that the sun never set on Britain's dominions, though in truth it set on millions who toiled in its shadow. The Victorians believed they were building civilization itself, and perhaps they were, but only for some. At night, when the gaslights flickered on the Thames, their glow reached no farther than the horizon. Beyond it lay the unseen cost: forests cut, cultures broken, languages silenced. Yet in the salons of Mayfair, the empire was a dream made real, a proof that man could master the world. And so the map kept growing, red and relentless. No one stopped to ask what it meant to own the world, or what it might mean to lose it. The empire's might was measured in ships and armies, but its soul was made of paper. In the gaslit evenings of Victorian London, the printing press worked harder than any engine. Its rhythm was the heartbeat of an age that believed words could civilize the world. Every day, sheets of ink-stained pages flew from iron machines, the scent of fresh paper thick in the air. Newspapers, novels, pamphlets, sermons, all spilling into the streets like the overflow of a restless mind. Before Victoria's reign, only the privileged could afford to read regularly. But now, letters had become democratic, as common as soot, as cheap as bread. The penny press had changed everything. For a single coin, a working man could buy the world. He could hold it in his hands on the way to the factory, learn of wars, scandals, and inventions, or lose himself in serialized tales that stretched over weeks and years. Dickens, Thackeray, Gaskell, their characters became as real as neighbors. Fiction had stepped out of parlors and into the streets. In this new republic of letters, everyone had a voice, or thought they did. Pamphleteers shouted revolution and reform. Preachers printed sermons that condemned the city's sin. Scientists published theories that threatened creation itself. And women, long silent under lace and law, began to write. Too, their pens soft but insistent. Each new volume was a rebellion in disguise. The Queen herself became a figure both revered and read about. Her life filled columns and illustrations, her speeches reprinted and discussed in shops and taverns. Yet she also read in private her journals, a confession only time would one day reveal. Between state papers and dispatches from India, she read poetry, romances, and sermons, her mind a library of contradictions. She ruled an empire with her hand and soothed her loneliness with words. The power of print reshaped not just thought, but time itself. Before, knowledge had moved at the pace of rumor. Now it raced through the veins of the city like blood. Newsboys ran shouting headlines through the fog, their voices echoing off brick and iron. In the cafes of Fleet Street, journalists argued through the night, their desks littered with drafts and half-drunk coffee. Typewriters clicked like clockwork hearts, feeding an appetite that would never be satisfied again. But the flood of information brought its own shadows. Lies traveled as fast as truth. Scandal sold better than science. For every page that lifted the mind, another dragged it lower. Some said the press was the new pulpit, others called it the mob given ink. The written word, once sacred, had become a marketplace. Still, the Victorians could not stop reading. They devoured everything: reports of crime, love stories, political debates, advertisements promising miracle tonics and eternal youth. The printed word had become the empire's new religion, and the city its cathedral. By mid-century, literacy was no longer a privilege but an expectation. Children in soot-stained smocks traced letters on chalkboards, their small hands shaping the future, one syllable at a time. And from that quiet revolution rose a truth: even the Queen could not contain that knowledge, once given to the masses, could never again be ruled. The empire might command the seas, but ink commanded the mind, and no army could march fast enough to silence it. The city had never been so alive or so haunted. By the 1840s, London had become a labyrinth of contradictions. Glittering boulevards built beside slums, charity beside cruelty, laughter beside hunger. It was a city of masks, and no one peeled them back quite like Charles Dickens. He walked its streets at night not as a gentleman, but as a witness. His stories were not inventions, they were reflections. He began his wanderings after midnight, coat collar raised against the damp, notebook hidden in his pocket. From Westminster's grand arches to the alleys of Limehouse, he saw the whole theatre of the empire. Chimney sweeps asleep in doorways, widows huddled over dying fires, beggars pretending blindness for pennies. He watched the city breathe deep, ragged, human, and wrote it down. When his words reached print, London recognized itself for the first time and shuddered. His novels were more than tales, they were mirrors that refused to flatter. Oliver Twist revealed the cruelty of the workhouse, where the poor were punished for surviving. Bleak House showed how justice itself had turned into an endless fog. Hard Times stripped the skin from industrial life, exposing how progress could crush the soul. Dickens wrote as though every sentence were a moral wound, each one cutting clean to the bone. Readers devoured his serialized chapters as if waiting for a sermon. In the poorest tenements, people pooled pennies to buy each new installment. In drawing rooms, aristocrats debated his characters over tea, pretending they didn't recognize their own reflections in the villains. Children wept for Little Nell. Factory workers saw themselves in Stephen Blackpool. Through fiction, the city began to see its own conscience. And yet, Dickens was not alone. He was part of a growing chorus: writers, reformers, and journalists who turned storytelling into protest. Elizabeth Gaskell wrote of women in the mills. Henry Mayhew catalogued the lives of street vendors and scavengers. Together they formed a new kind of power, one born not of title or wealth, but of empathy sharpened by ink. The government, uneasy, called it sentimentality, but the readers called it truth. Within a decade, reforms began to trickle from Parliament's stone halls: child labour laws, sanitation acts, and charitable housing schemes. Literature had reached where legislation had not: the human heart. Still, Dickens's city refused to change easily. The fog he wrote about was more than weather, it was a spirit, a sickness of indifference. Each time the lamps were lit along the Thames, the smoke swallowed them again. Hope and despair shared the same breath. By the end of his life, Dickens was a national monument mourned by millions, studied by schools, immortalized by statues. But the streets he walked remained much the same. The poor still huddled in shadows. The rich still passed them by. Yet somewhere, in the glow of a reading lamp or the hush of a classroom, a young reader still turns his pages and sees not just the Victorian world, but their own. For that was Dickens's true invention. Not the stories, but the mirror he left behind. It reflected a city in love with progress but starved of compassion, a city still walking the narrow road between greatness and guilt. The night changed first. Before gas, darkness had been absolute, a living thing that swallowed sound and shape alike. People feared it, prayed through it, locked their doors against it. Then came the flicker, small and trembling, in the narrow lanes of Pall Mall. One lamp, then a row, then a city reborn in flame. The age of gaslight had begun, and nothing would ever be hidden quite the same way again. London at night became a spectacle. Streets, once haunted by thieves, now shimmered with amber haze. The fog, once black as ink, turned golden and alive, glowing like liquid honey through the smoke. Theatres opened later, taverns filled longer, and the city learned a new rhythm, that of sleeplessness. For the first time, the dark was not a limit, but a stage. Lamplighters became its priests, moving slowly down the boulevards at dusk, poles in hand, touching each lamp like a prayer. A hiss, a spark, a bloom of light repeated hundreds of times until the whole street seemed to breathe. Children watched in awe as the night bloomed into day again, each flame dancing against the fog like a promise that the dark could be tamed. But gaslight was more than beauty. It was power. Factories that once closed at sunset now ran through the night. Workhouses glowed, their windows reflecting an endless grind. The city's appetite had grown, and gas answered it. The same fire that warmed parlours and theatres also lit the long, grey halls where labourers stitched and hammered through sleepless hours. The night no longer belonged to rest. It belonged to production. In the homes of the wealthy, the glow was softer. Chandeliers of etched glass shimmered above velvet carpets. Dinner parties sparkled, their laughter reflecting in 1,000 golden facets. Guests admired the brilliance, never thinking of the men who climbed iron poles in the rain to keep the flame alive, or the workers who toiled in the gasworks, where explosions and suffocation were a daily risk. Progress has always burned brightest at the edges where no one looks. Still, the world was intoxicated by its own illumination. Painters studied the new light, its gentle diffusion and strange melancholy. Writers spoke of its poetry, how it turned the mundane into the mysterious. Lovers met beneath its glow, their shadows stretching across cobblestones like ghosts. And in those same shadows, new fears grew, crimes of anonymity, secrets that the light revealed only halfway. Under gaslight, nothing was truly hidden, but nothing was truly seen either. By mid-century, London was the brightest city on earth, its skyline a halo of flame visible for miles. Travellers arriving by train saw it shimmer through the fog like a phantom sun. They called it magnificent. They called it modern. But those who lived beneath it knew that the light came at a cost, that the more the city glowed, the less it slept, and the less it dreamed. The night had once been nature's pause, a breath, a mercy. Gaslight stole it, and in its place gave humanity something else, endurance. And so the lamps burned on, each one a small sun feeding an empire that could no longer bear to rest. It began with the river. By the 1850s, the Thames no longer flowed, it festered. The great artery of the empire had turned brown, thick and sour, carrying the waste of 4 million souls toward the sea. On hot days, its stench rose through the city like a fever. Curtains were soaked in vinegar to keep the smell out of Parliament. Gentlemen pressed handkerchiefs to their faces as they crossed the bridges. Even the Queen fled the capital when the wind turned east. They called it the Great Stink, but it was more than that. It was a symptom of denial, of ambition, of a century that built faster than it could breathe. Beneath London's progress lay rot. Cesspools overflowed beneath every street. Sewage seeped into the same wells that drew the city's drinking water. Rats multiplied faster than sermons, and the word cholera became a prayer whispered and ignored. In the poorer quarters, disease had its own geography. The slums near the docks were struck first. Families lived stacked in damp rooms where the walls wept with moisture and the floors crawled with insects. When cholera came, it needed no invitation. It traveled through water and air alike, invisible but everywhere. Children dropped where they played. Mothers followed days later. The lucky died quickly. The unlucky lingered grey, gasping, parched with thirst, while surrounded by water that could only kill them. Doctors argued over cause and cure. Some blamed miasma, a poisonous vapor rising from decay. Others, quietly radical, suspected something smaller, invisible organisms, life too tiny to see. But science moved slower than panic. The city buried its dead and went back to work. Then came a man named John Snow, a physician with the stubborn patience of a detective. In 1854, when cholera swept through Soho, he traced the deaths to a single water pump on Broad Street. He removed the handle, and the epidemic stopped. It was not the air that poisoned London, but the water. The discovery should have changed everything, but it didn't. Not yet. Belief clings harder than reason. Meanwhile, the smell worsened. The summer of 1858 baked the river into a liquid tomb. Parliament's curtains could no longer hold back the rot. Debates halted mid-sentence. The Times wrote that the Thames had become a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horror. Finally, progress found its savior, an engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. He envisioned a vast network of underground sewers, a cathedral of brick and stone that would cleanse the city from beneath. It took years and thousands of men to carve his design into the earth. They worked by lantern light, waist-deep in filth, building tunnels wide enough for carriages to pass through. When the system opened, the river began to clear, and the air softened. London could breathe again, but only just. The Victorians celebrated their victory over filth as proof of moral progress. They built monuments to sanitation and toasted to cleanliness as if it were salvation. But beneath the triumph lay a truth they dared not admit. The rot had never left. It had only learned to hide deeper, behind brick, beneath ground, beneath conscience. The Thames still flowed, quieter now, carrying the memory of a century that mistook brightness for purity and built its glory on the scent of decay. The century had always believed in order, in a universe arranged like clockwork, wound once by the divine hand and left to tick in perfect harmony. But by the middle years of Queen Victoria's reign, that certainty began to tremble. Something unseen was stirring in the laboratories, the lecture halls, the minds of men who asked questions older than scripture. The Victorians were about to discover that faith and reason could not share the same cage forever. It started quietly with microscopes and fossils. In dusty rooms smelling of spirits and chalk, naturalists stared at the bones of creatures long extinct, at shells embedded in mountains, at the deep scars of time written in stone. Each discovery whispered of a world far older than Genesis had allowed. The earth, they realized, was not 6,000 years old. It was ancient, immeasurable, indifferent. The realization did not roar. It crept. Then, in 1859, the whisper became thunder. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species arrived in London like a storm breaking through glass. Its words were calm, almost modest, but their meaning struck like lightning. Life had not been designed in perfection. It had clawed its way upward, one adaptation at a time, through struggle and death. Humanity was not divine creation, but kin to the ape. The very order of heaven had been rewritten in the language of survival. The reaction was immediate and furious. In drawing rooms and pulpits, men argued until their voices broke. Bishops called it heresy. Scholars called it liberation. Newspapers printed caricatures of Darwin as a half-man, half-monkey, while preachers warned that morality itself would crumble if man descended from beasts. Yet curiosity spread faster than outrage. The theory gave people something religion could not, a map of existence that asked for observation, not obedience. Science had begun to eclipse the pulpit. The telegraph wired words across oceans. Chemistry bottled elements of the invisible. Electricity lit cities once ruled by darkness. Every discovery made the universe seem larger and the soul smaller. Still, faith did not die, it adapted. Clergymen preached that evolution was God's tool, that creation was not a single act but an eternal unfolding. For every man of science, there was another who knelt beside his microscope and whispered a prayer. In parlors, the educated wrestled with uncertainty. Could a world without miracles still have meaning? If man was just another animal, what became of sin, of grace, of purpose? The Victorians did not find answers so much as they learned to live with the questions. The age of wonder had become the age of doubt, and both coexisted uneasily, side by side, like gaslight and shadow. By the end of the century, the museums were crowded with the trophies of discovery, fossils, specimens, machines, each labeled with neat Latin names, each a small rebellion against mystery. Yet somewhere beyond the glass, cases, choirs still sang, candles still burned, and hearts still sought the comfort of the unseen. For all their progress, the Victorians could not choose between heaven and earth, and so they lived, suspended between both, praying to God and measuring his handiwork with rulers and microscopes. The light in the operating room was merciless. It spilled from high windows onto steel instruments laid out in perfect rows, scalpels, bone saws, forceps, their edges gleaming like frozen fire. The air was thick with the scent of carbolic acid and sweat, of fear masked by formality. In a corner, a young nurse wrung her hands while a surgeon, sleeves rolled to the elbow, examined his tools with the precision of a watchmaker. Outside, the hospital hummed with the restless noise of the city. But inside these walls, time stood still. Before this century, surgery had been a kind of living nightmare. Patients were strapped down, held by strong men, and prayed over while the blade did its work. There was no mercy, only speed. A surgeon's reputation was measured not by how gently he cut, but by how quickly he finished before shock or pain stole the patient's breath. The smell of blood filled the wards like incense. For centuries, healing had required a sacrifice of agony. Then came the miracle of sleep. In the 1840s, news spread from America of a gas that could silence pain ether. Soon after, chloroform followed, smoother, deadlier, and deceptively sweet. When Queen Victoria herself used it during childbirth in 1853, the moral arguments vanished overnight. What God had once ordained as suffering was now optional. Surgeons across Britain embraced the power of oblivion. For the first time in history, the body could be opened without screaming. Yet sleep brought new dangers. Ether was explosive. Chloroform could kill in seconds. Some patients never woke again. The line between relief and death was measured in drops. Still, the advance was unstoppable. Men who had once fainted at the sight of the knife now volunteered for surgery. Hospitals became temples of progress, where medicine was not merely practiced but performed. Crowds of students filled the galleries, notebooks ready, watching flesh yield to knowledge. But another revolution was waiting, hidden in the unseen world of infection. No matter how clean the cut, death often followed. Wounds turned black, fevers rose, and the word sepsis became a death sentence whispered in hallways. Then, in the 1860s, a Scottish surgeon named Joseph Lister took inspiration from Louis Pasteur's discoveries about germs. He began washing his hands, his instruments, Even the air itself, with carbolic acid. The stench was unbearable, the results undeniable. Mortality rates dropped. The invisible enemy had finally been named. Not everyone believed him at first. Many called him a fanatic. They could not imagine that death itself might live on their hands. But one by one, the skeptics fell silent as patients stopped dying. The surgical theatre became cleaner, quieter, almost holy in its sterility. By the end of the century, the surgeon's table had transformed from an altar of pain into a stage of precision. Metal replaced wood, gowns replaced waistcoats, and gloves, that simple barrier of rubber, became the symbol of a new kind of purity. Still, beneath the bright lamps and white coats, the truth lingered. Progress had been bought with blood. Every breakthrough was written in scars. And though the patient now slept through the cutting, the surgeon never did. He carried every life and every failure in the silence that followed when the instruments were finally still. It was an age that dressed in black. Every street, every parlor, every portrait seemed touched by shadow. Death had always been familiar to humanity, but to the Victorians it became something sacred, a ritual, a fashion, a mirror held up to life itself. When someone died, the mourning began not in silence, but in ceremony. Curtains were drawn, clocks were stopped, mirrors were covered with cloth to keep the soul from being trapped. The house became a shrine to absence. In the corner of the sitting room, the coffin would rest, polished wood, brass handles, a wreath of lilies wilting at its crown. Neighbors came quietly, gloved and solemn, their condolences rehearsed. Children were told not to laugh. The air itself seemed to kneel. For weeks, sometimes months, the family would move through their grief by rule. Mourning was not emotion, it was etiquette. The depth of sorrow was measured by the shade of one's dress. A widow in full black was untouchable, a monument of respectability and restraint. The fashion began at the palace. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Queen Victoria buried her joy with him. She wore black for the rest of her life, turning her private sorrow into a national religion. Pain, when expressed with such grandeur, became virtue. Shops sold mourning garments, stationery bordered in black, jewelry made of jet or woven from the hair of the dead. The empire followed its queen into bereavement. Even servants were required to mourn for months. Mourning became an art form. Photographers captured the deceased in their finest clothes, eyes closed, faces serene, the last portrait before eternity. Some even posed the living beside their dead children, propping them up with hidden stands to mimic life. These memento mori photographs were not seen as morbid, but as merciful proof that love could defy time. To hold a photograph of the dead was to believe that death could be framed, controlled, even understood. In the cemeteries that blossomed beyond the city walls, death became almost beautiful. Marble angels stretched their wings over ivy and fog. Mausoleums stood like miniature temples among the yew trees. Sunday walks through Highgate or Kensal Green were as fashionable as any promenade. Families picnicked among the graves, reading epitaphs like poetry. To mourn was not to hide from death, it was to live beside it. Yet beneath the lace veils and etiquette lay a deeper fear. Science was dismantling heaven one discovery at a time, and faith was no longer certain. The afterlife, once a promise, had become a question. Spiritualists rose to fill the void, mediums who claimed to speak with the departed, tables that rapped and tilted in candlelight. Grief had turned into hunger, a need to hear a single word from the silence. The Victorians made death bearable by making it visible. They clothed it, perfumed it, gave it a place in the parlor, but the more they adorned it, the more it lingered. Mourning was meant to end, yet for many, it became a way of life, a quiet devotion to what could never return. And so the age continued, shrouded in velvet and memory, its heart beating softly beneath a veil. Death was no longer an ending, but a companion always near, always proper, and always watching from the mirror beneath the cloth. The ships came first, black silhouettes against a white sun carrying letters, silks, soldiers, and the hum of another world. When they docked at Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras, the air itself seemed to shift. India was not just a colony, it was the empire's mirror, dazzling, fevered, contradictory. Its markets overflowed with color and scent, its people numbered in millions, its history stretched older than London's stones. To the Victorians, it was both treasure and burden, paradise and conquest. In the early years, they spoke of partnership. British officers called themselves protectors, and missionaries, teachers. Railways and telegraphs were laid like veins across the subcontinent, binding it to the heart of London. Tea plantations rose in Assam, cotton fields in Bengal, indigo and opium, in between crops grown not for the people, but for the empire's appetite. India became the empire's pulse, its wealth running silently east to west. Yet, for every bridge built and school opened, there was a silence that deepened. British rule came with laws, taxes, and an arrogance dressed as civility. The old empires of the Mughals and Marathas were swept aside, their palaces turned to barracks. The English language replaced Persian in courts, and the Union Jack flew above temples and mosques alike. Beneath the rhetoric of progress, humiliation festered a wound disguised as order. Then, in 1857, that silence broke. It began with whispers among sepoys, Indian soldiers serving under British command. Rumors spread that the cartridges of their rifles were greased with cow and pig fat, defiling both Hindu and Muslim faiths. The insult was small, but it was enough. When the first shots rang out in Meerut, the empire trembled. The rebellion spread like fire across the plains, Delhi, Cawnpur, Lucknow. Villages rose, officers fled, and for a brief moment, India spoke with one voice. London called it the Mutiny. India remembered it as the First War of Independence. The truth lay between the two, a war born not only of religion, but of pride, exhaustion, and centuries of intrusion. The British answered with terror of their own reprisals, so brutal they silenced rebellion for a generation. When the smoke cleared, the East India Company was dissolved, and India passed directly into the Queen's hands. In 1876, Victoria took a new title, Empress of India. To many in Britain, it was triumph. To many in India, it was the sound of a door closing. The empire now stretched from Canada to Cape Town, but it was India that made it rich, its jewels, its spices, its soldiers. Railways carried its goods, but also its grief. The very tracks that connected the nation also carried famine, as crops grown for export left its people starving. And yet, beneath the weight of empire, India endured. Poets wrote in secret, rebels spoke in code, and students read English philosophy only to turn it against their rulers. The same education meant to pacify them lit the fire of freedom. A generation was coming that would remember both the conqueror's laws and the sound of its own ancient songs. In the halls of London, they toasted to dominion, but in the monsoon-soaked streets of Calcutta, a new wind was rising, one that spoke softly at first, then louder, until even across the sea, it could no longer be ignored. It was the voice from India, and it would one day echo back to the empire that thought it could own the world. They left from the same docks that sent tea to England and soldiers to India, long, narrow ships with sails the color of bone and holds packed tight with misery. The British called it trade, the Chinese called it poison. Each vessel carried a cargo that glittered like amber and destroyed like fire. Crates of opium refined in Bengal, guarded by red-coated soldiers, bound for the harbours of Canton. In the counting houses of London, it was all written neatly in ledgers, weights, profits, routes. The East India Company had turned addiction into arithmetic. From poppy fields in the valleys of Patna to the factories along the Thames, the empire's wealth flowed through a vein of narcotic smoke. Merchants toasted to fortune as if it were virtue, never seeing the faces behind the figures, farmers forced to grow poppy instead of grain, families who starved while their land bloomed with flowers that would never feed them. In China, The ports began to rot from within. Opium dens spread like a fever through Canton and Shanghai. In the dim haze of lamplight, men reclined on bamboo beds, smoke curling from their lips in lazy spirals. The drug softened hunger, blurred time, made empire and poverty equally distant. But the price was ruin. By the 1830s, millions were enslaved to the pipe. The emperor demanded an end to the trade. Britain replied with gunboats. The opium wars were not fought for freedom, but for markets. When Chinese officials confiscated and burned British opium, the empire answered with fire and steel. Cannons shattered coastal forts. Treaties followed like signatures on wounds. By the Treaty of Nanking in 1842, Hong Kong was ceded, ports were opened, and indemnities paid. Britain called it victory. The world called it what it was, conquest masked as commerce. Back home, the British public rarely asked what filled the ships returning from the East. They praised the silk, the porcelain, the tea, never the powder, that made them possible. The opium profits flowed invisibly into banks and estates, building railways, mansions, universities. The same empire that preached morality to its colonies was now funded by addiction. Even in London, the drug found its way home. In the back rooms of apothecaries, tinctures of laudanum were sold over the counter, prescribed for sleeplessness, for nerves, for grief. It was called the Englishman's solace. Poets wrote under its spell. Housewives sipped it from crystal spoons. In one form or another, the empire was consuming itself. Yet there was a strange, poetic irony in the whole affair. The empire that prided itself on discipline had built its fortune on dependence. The Victorians called it trade, but history would call it something darker the day civilization learned to profit from decay. By the 1880s, the poppy fields of India still shimmered under the sun, and the ships still sailed eastward, their sails catching the same wind that once carried missionaries and kings. The empire had many flags, but they all cast the same shadow. In the end, the opium ships did more than poison nations. They revealed the empire's truest face. One hand raised in the name of progress, the other quietly feeding the world's hunger for oblivion. Long before the factories awoke, before the first whistle split the dawn, the cotton was already moving. It came from across oceans, raw, white, innocent-looking, packed in bales from India, from Egypt, from the plantations of America. Each tuft carried the fingerprints of the unseen. Slaves, laborers, farmers, bent beneath sun and empire. When it reached the docks of Liverpool or Manchester, it was no longer plant or fiber, it was profit. The cotton empire had arrived, and its flag was woven from both brilliance and brutality. In the great mills of Lancashire, the air was thick with lint and heat. The walls trembled from the thunder of looms, hundreds of them clattering in rhythm, their iron arms flashing like blades. The sound was relentless, deafening. Women and children worked 12 hours beneath that metallic heartbeat, their hands quick, their voices lost in the din. The overseer's stick struck the floor in time with the machines. Progress had found its pulse, and it was measured in revolutions per minute. Cotton ruled everything. It clothed the empire and funded its wars. From the corsets of London's aristocracy to the tents of soldiers in India, from the curtains in Buckingham Palace to the uniforms in the Crimea, everything was spun from the same thread. The empire had built an entire civilization on softness and the suffering that made it. In the American South, the fields were white seas of silence. Enslaved men and women bent to pick the empire's wealth from the soil. Their songs carried on winds that crossed the Atlantic. In the counting rooms of Liverpool, men in waistcoats and spectacles balanced ledgers that made no mention of human names, only weights and measures, only pounds and shillings. Slavery was distant enough to ignore, close enough to sustain everything. When the American Civil War broke out, it was as though the empire had stopped breathing. The blockade on southern ports cut off the raw cotton supply, and suddenly the mills fell silent. Thousands in Manchester lost work overnight. Families starved, yet still they gathered in public halls to support the Union. cause ordinary workers who understood that no wealth could be clean if it came from chains. Their protest echoed louder than the looms. To survive, Britain turned back to its colonies. India's soil was forced into new obedience fields once rich with grain, now planted with cotton for export. Famine followed, and still the ships came, their holds filled with white fibre bound for northern England. It was said that a single pound of Lancashire cloth cost 10 Indian lives. The empire's greatest fabric was also its most fragile illusion. By the 1880s, the cities of the north glowed red with industrial fire. Smoke curled above the chimneys like offerings to a mechanical god. The cotton mills stood as temples to that god, monuments of ingenuity, discipline, and denial. Visitors called them marvels of civilization. The workers called them cages. Every empire tells itself that its wealth is destiny, but the truth clings to every thread, from the fingers that picked the cotton to the hands that bled weaving it. When the wind blew through the alleys of Manchester, the lint floated like snow, soft and white and suffocating. The world had been dressed in the empire's fabric, but beneath the polished waistcoats and lace curtains, the skin still remembered what it cost to stay clothed. Change, in the Victorian world, often began in whispers, and more often still, in parlours. Behind lace curtains and the flicker of lamplight, women began to gather. They came with sewing baskets and tea at first, under the guise of gentility, but what they truly brought were questions. Why should poverty be inherited? Why should education belong to men? Why should silence be the price of respectability? They called themselves ladies, as society required, but history would remember them as something fiercer, reformers. They lived in a world ruled by men's voices, Parliament, the press, the pulpit, yet within the boundaries drawn for them, they built new kinds of power. Some were aristocrats moved by charity. Others were middle-class teachers and nurses driven by exhaustion from what they saw daily. All shared a conviction that the empire could not call itself civilized while half its citizens were treated as fragile ornaments. Florence Nightingale was one of the first to defy that fragility. In the Crimean War, she left the drawing rooms of England for hospitals filled with mud, blood, and screams. By lamplight, she wrote reports that would shame an army and rebuild the practice of medicine. When she returned home, the government offered her medals. She demanded sanitation reform. Her lamp became more than light, it became conscience. Others followed with quieter flames. Elizabeth Fry fought to humanize the prisons, bringing Bibles and compassion to women chained in darkness. Josephine Butler campaigned against laws that branded poor women as diseased while leaving their exploiters untouched. Hannah More and the Quakers founded schools for the forgotten, the chimney sweep, the servant girl, the orphan. These women understood what the empire's leaders did not, that a society's greatness is measured not by its wealth, but by how it treats its weakest. Their enemies were not only men, but the ideals that had shaped womanhood for centuries. The angel in the house, the submissive wife, the quiet daughter, these were chains forged from courtesy. To question them was to risk exile from polite society. And yet, they did. Through pamphlets, petitions, and persistence, the ladies of reform turned morality into activism. They spoke not with anger, but with an iron calm that frightened their opponents far more. By mid-century, their influence had spread like light through fog. The nursing schools, the charitable missions, the educational societies, each a seed planted by women who refused to wait for permission. They entered workhouses and slums where no statesman dared to tread, armed only with conviction and handkerchiefs soaked in carbolic. The poor trusted them because they listened. The powerful feared them because they would not stop. In Parliament, their petitions were read aloud and dismissed, yet their persistence outlasted the laughter. One reform led to another: child labor laws, compulsory schooling, sanitation acts, shelters for the homeless. The women were never given credit, but the city grew cleaner, the streets safer, the hospitals less cruel. By the century's end, their daughters would carry the fight further into voting halls and protest marches, demanding the final equality their mothers had only imagined. But it was the ladies of reform who first proved that compassion could be political, and that change, though born in whispers, could one day shake the empire itself. They began with charity, but what they built was revolution stitched quietly, thread by thread, beneath the same lamps that once burned only for embroidery and prayer. The sound of London's morning was not the rustle of silk or the clip of carriage wheels. It was the shuffle of bare feet, small feet, by the millions. The children of the empire, unseen, uncounted, indispensable. They were the hands that swept the ashes, the voices that sold the papers, the eyes that learned to see in soot and darkness. The empire called them its future, but it was a future paid for in hunger. At the break of day, the first to wake were the climbing boys' chimney sweeps no older than 7. Thin as rope, they were sent up the flues before dawn, carrying brushes longer than their bodies. Inside the brick shafts, they climbed in silence, scraping soot until their lungs burned black. A slip meant suffocation. A spark meant death. But the masters called them lucky. Their smallness made them useful. By nightfall, they slept in the same soot they cleared, curled like embers in corners of the workshop. In the factories of Manchester and Leeds, others worked by gaslight. Girls with tangled hair and raw fingers fed thread through spinning machines that shrieked like banshees. Their dresses caught easily in the gears. Their hearing vanished before adulthood. Boys hauled coal carts underground for a few shillings a week, their backs permanently bent. They were called drawers and trappers, names that turned children into tools. The schools, when they existed, were crowded and cold. A dozen children shared one book. The teacher's cane spoke louder than his lessons. But most never saw the inside of a classroom. Illiteracy was the quiet inheritance of the poor, a blindness passed from parent to child, a guarantee that they would never climb higher than the factory stairs. And yet, in every alley, there was laughter. Even misery has its games. The street urchins played with buttons and bottle caps, their joy as fierce as their hunger. They sold matches, sang songs, begged with charm. London's children learned to survive with the cunning of foxes. The city belonged to them in ways it never would. To the rich they knew every hidden stair, every shortcut through the fog. Writers began to notice them. Dickens gave them names: Oliver, Joe, Tiny Tim, faces that looked back from the page like accusations. Reformers began to follow. Ragged schools opened in abandoned chapels, offering free lessons, a bowl of soup, a moment of warmth. Philanthropists and missionaries poured in, armed with good intentions and ledgers. They could not save them all, but they began to make the invisible visible. By the 1870s, laws slowly began to shift. Child labor was limited, schooling became compulsory, but the streets never emptied. Every new generation seemed to replace the last. Progress came at the pace of pity. The Victorians liked to say children were angels, but their angels were working, pulling carts, scrubbing floors, cleaning chimneys. Their small hands kept the empire running, unseen beneath its grandeur. And so, when the factory bells rang at dawn, their voices rose again, the chorus of the invisible. It was not song, but survival. The music of a century that believed itself civilized while building its greatness on the bones of its children. The world had learned to speak in light. In the 1840s, a new invention arrived in London and every other city that mattered: the camera. It captured what the eye could barely remember, freezing motion, time, and memory in a single exposure. People lined up in studios, stiff and uncertain, as men with long coats and even longer patience adjusted lenses, measured light, and whispered directions. The age of the photograph had begun, and with it, a new way of seeing both life and death. At first, the subjects were the wealthy. Families posed in their finest clothes, daughters in lace, sons in velvet jackets, the Queen herself in jewels that glimmered like captive stars. Every portrait was a statement: power, status, permanence. The photograph promised to preserve them against time, against decay, against mortality. A single image could say what words could never: that they existed, that they mattered, that their lives were worthy of remembrance. But the technology did not remain in the drawing rooms. Street photographers wandered through the alleys of London, setting up small studios and capturing faces that had never been painted by an artist. Sailors, labourers, and chimney sweeps sat for minutes at a time, staring into a lens that could hold them forever. The poor began to appear on paper, their features immortalized in silver and glass. In a world that had often ignored them, the camera could not look away. Death, too, became a subject. Victorian families embraced the macabre with quiet ritual. Children who had died of fever or malnutrition were dressed and positioned for post-mortem photographs. They were propped on chairs, pillows hidden behind them, eyes closed in imitation of sleep. Parents held their infants or siblings, creating a tableau meant to preserve love, even in the face of irretrievable loss. These images were called memento mori, reminders that life was fragile, that memory could be stronger than absence. Photographs became a bridge between worlds. They recorded the factories, the hospitals, the streets, and the parlor salons alike. A child at play in Whitechapel could exist alongside a child in Mayfair in the pages of a magazine. Industry and intimacy, wealth and poverty, life and death, all captured in a single frame, each photograph a testament to an era that could not stop itself from recording. The impact rippled outward. Families sent portraits across oceans to relatives in India, Canada, and Australia. Soldiers carried them to wars in Crimea and India. Lovers kept them tucked beneath pillows. Soldiers pressed them into coat pockets. The photograph made distance irrelevant, and yet it made the passage of time painfully clear. Each captured moment was already a ghost. By the end of the century, photography had transformed the world's memory. Histories were now literal, tangible. Even the ordinary could be preserved with startling clarity. Yet the ease of recording did not prevent suffering. The mills, the streets, the hospitals still existed in full detail, and the photographs captured them just as faithfully as the palaces. The Victorians had learned that light could lie, that it could flatter, embellish, and deceive, but it could also reveal. And so the age of the photograph became both mirror and witness, capturing not only what they wanted to remember, but what they could not escape. In the amber glow of early prints, the empire, in all its brilliance and decay, stared back at itself, unflinching, immortal, and yet forever haunted by the faces it had never truly seen. The heat was suffocating, even before the smell arrived. By the summer of 1858, London had become a city sweating under its own weight. The river, the mighty Thames, had turned brown and viscous, carrying refuse, waste, and rot in a thick, choking flow. Every breeze that blew from its banks brought with it a stench so potent that Parliament itself threatened to adjourn. The city was drowning in its own filth, and no one could ignore it any longer. For weeks, the air hung heavy with decay. Newspapers reported on the unbearable conditions. Coal-stained workers fainted in the streets, children coughed through the haze, and horses stumbled in the muck. The rich fled to the suburbs, the poor had nowhere to hide. Houses along the river became tombs of odour, where families tried to barricade the summer with vinegar-soaked cloths and candles. Londoners whispered about plague and cholera illnesses, always lurking behind the veil of smoke and grime, knowing that the river had become the city's own poisoned artery. The problem was centuries in the making. Sewage had long been dumped directly into the Thames. Latrines and cesspits overflowed in alleyways, puddling with waste that never drained. Rain only spread the filth further, carrying it into streets, houses, and wells. Cholera had struck repeatedly, and still the solutions were slow, half measures applied with polite hesitation. Industrial growth had been more urgent than hygiene. Expansion outpaced understanding, and the consequences were now unbearable. The sensation of smell was not just nuisance but terror. Visitors recoiled at the riverbanks, members of Parliament gagged in their own chambers. Even Queen Victoria, travelling along the Thames, could not escape the odor, which crept through closed windows and curtains. Doctors warned that the stench alone could weaken the body, and the fear of disease became almost tactile, an oppressive presence that pressed on the lungs and nerves alike. Finally, urgency reached the government. Joseph Bazalgette, a young civil engineer, was commissioned to construct a vast network of underground sewers, a solution as ambitious as it was necessary. Thousands of workers descended into tunnels, waist-deep in waste, carving brick channels that would carry the river's poison away from the heart of the city. The labor was relentless, the air thick with smoke, dust, and the faint promise of relief. By the time the network was completed, the Thames began to breathe again. Its waters cleared slowly, as if exhaling centuries of neglect. Yet the victory was incomplete. The river no longer reeked, but it retained its memory. Every chemical trace, every invisible organism, every unspoken crime of neglect lingered beneath the surface. London had conquered its smell, but only with effort, labor, and the suffering of those who had lived closest to the rot. The victory belonged not to the city itself, but to the engineers and laborers who risked health and life to rebuild the arteries of civilization. The Great Stink became legend, a moment where the city recognized its own vulnerability. It was more than odor, it was a revelation. Progress could not ignore nature, civilization could not ignore decay, and in the end, the Thames carried the lesson quietly to the sea. Even the mightiest empire could be undone by what it refused to cleanse. London had survived. But the smell, once familiar, was now a ghost, lingering in memory as a warning that growth without care is always temporary. The world was being carved in brick, iron, and stone, not by kings or generals, not by ministers in parliament, but by men who understood the language of steel and steam. They were the engineers, the architects of motion, of water, of power itself. Their hands measured continents, their eyes traced rivers, their calculations reached farther than the most ambitious monarch dared. The empire's reach was limited not by ambition, but by their skill. Joseph Bazalgette, fresh from the chaos of the Great Stink, became a symbol of this new class. He designed a network of sewers so vast that it seemed to exist beneath the entire city, an invisible river carrying the filth away from London's heart. For weeks, men labored underground, waist-deep in waste, chiseling tunnels through clay and brick. The smell was unimaginable, the danger constant, yet the vision carried them forward. The Thames would breathe again, and with it, the city would live. Elsewhere, the same engineers built bridges that spanned rivers like ribbons of iron. The men of the Great Western Railway traced their lines across mountains and valleys, carving tunnels through stone that had been undisturbed for millennia. Steam locomotives thundered across these paths, their whistles announcing that distance was no longer a limit, that the empire could bind itself together with speed and precision. Every mile of track carried coal, cotton, soldiers, and letters, the lifeblood of Britain itself. Their work extended beyond Britain. Railways were laid in India to extract resources more efficiently, in Africa to control trade routes, in Canada to tame vast stretches of wilderness. Every bridge, every aqueduct, every telegraph pole was a mark of authority, a proof that the empire could be engineered as easily as it could be imagined. Maps were redrawn with confidence, lines no longer arbitrary but calculated, measured, precise. The world became an equation, and the engineers held the formula. Yet, their genius was tempered by sacrifice. Thousands of laborers perished building these marvels, crushed by rock, drowned in floods, consumed by disease. The engineers themselves were not immune. Many fell ill from exposure to dust, chemicals, and fumes. The hands that held pen and compass also trembled over blueprints, calculating the weight of iron and the pressure of steam, while knowing that a single misstep could kill hundreds. Progress demanded nothing less than courage and, in some measure, cruelty. By mid-century, London glittered with monuments to their work. Aqueducts carried water for millions, Bridges spanned rivers with elegant arcs, and stations glimmered with iron and glass like modern cathedrals. But for every visible achievement, there were countless invisible ones: tunnels, foundations, networks, cables, the hidden sinews that held the city together. Without them, the grandeur above would collapse into mud, smoke, and chaos. The empire learned to bow to these men. Parliament passed acts in their favor. Investors flooded them with capital. The public revered them as visionaries. Their maps became law. Their blueprints became scripture. Britain's domination of the globe was as much a triumph of calculation as it was of gunpowder. And yet, even as the engineers shaped the world, they did not control it entirely. Rivers shifted, mountains resisted, storms destroyed. Nature reminded them that their skill, for all its precision, was still subject to the Earth's whims. But they persevered, designing ever bigger, ever stronger, ever faster. The engineers of the Victorian Empire were invisible monarchs, shaping a world that could only function because of their knowledge, labor, and vision. Their monuments were not gilded palaces, but bridges, tunnels, sewers, and rails, silent testaments to an age that believed progress could be measured, calculated, and controlled. Yet behind every arch and under every track lay the pulse of a city, nation, and an empire sustained by ingenuity, sweat, and an unflinching determination to bend the world to human will. The wind carried the first scent of war long before the cannons roared. In the spring of 1853, the Crimean Peninsula became a theater for the empire's ambition and its hubris. Soldiers marched across mud-slick roads, their boots sinking into earth that had not been tended, that bore the memory of countless battles long forgotten. The sun rose pale over Sevastopol, illuminating the white tents of encampments that smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. And in the midst of it all, a single woman moved through the carnage, a lantern in her hand, her eyes steady with purpose. Florence Nightingale had crossed the empire not as an aristocrat or a diplomat, but as a healer. She arrived in Scutari with her team of nurses, all women who had traded domestic lives for the stench and terror of war. They were met with skepticism, even hostility. Men who had never been cared for by women balked at the thought that their wounds might be tended with kindness rather than command. The hospitals were overflowing. Patients lay on the floors, on straw, on broken cots. Disease spread faster than bullets. Cholera, typhus, dysentery. Death stalked the wards as freely as the wind swept through the tents. By lamplight, Florence observed the chaos. She counted the casualties, catalogued the infections, noted the unsanitary conditions. She demanded clean water, better ventilation, and the most basic hygiene. Her insistence was met with resistance, yet slowly the hospitals began to change. The wards were scrubbed, the bedding washed, the patients tended with steady hands. The first interventions were small, almost imperceptible, a change in procedure, a new routine, but they saved lives. Her lantern became a symbol. Soldiers whispered about the lady with the lamp, the woman who moved through the darkness, checking wounds, offering water, offering hope. In the cold of night, when the wind cut through tattered uniforms and frost-stiffened limbs, her presence was a reminder that the empire's machinery could be tempered with mercy. The Crimean light was not merely physical, it illuminated the failures of the military bureaucracy, the inefficiency of supply chains, and the brutality of neglect. Florence recorded everything meticulously, publishing her observations later in Notes on Nursing, which became a manual not just for nurses, but for the reform of hospitals worldwide. Her work transformed medicine into science and compassion into duty, yet the battlefield remained indifferent. The wind carried the cries of the wounded, the smell of gunpowder, the fog of smoke. Cannon fire split the dawn, shells shredded tents, and the land itself seemed to conspire against the living. Florence's victories were quiet, incremental, fought in corridors and wards rather than on hills and beaches. For every life saved, another was lost. By the end of the war, her impact was undeniable. Mortality rates dropped dramatically in hospitals under her supervision. Soldiers returned home not only as veterans of battle, but as witnesses to a new kind of care, one that valued hygiene, observation, and human dignity. Night after night, the image of a lamp moving steadily through the darkness became emblematic of hope and reform. The Crimean light endured beyond the peninsula. It traveled to the hospitals of London, Paris, and beyond, carrying with it a revelation. Progress was not only made on battlefields, in factories, or on the seas. It was made in quiet acts of attention, in the application of knowledge to suffering, in the courage to see what no one else would. And in that light, the Victorian Empire began to understand that its greatness could not rest solely on conquest. It must shine where life itself demanded care. The parlour was fragrant with secrets. Victorian England had long been a country obsessed with appearances, with manners, with the invisible boundaries that separated the polite from the improper. In the midst of these rigid codes, a subtle language took root, one that spoke without words, without sound, without the risk of scandal. Flowers became the punctuation of desire, sorrow, and devotion. Each petal, each bloom, each carefully chosen arrangement carried a message meant only for those who knew how to read it. It began simply enough. Gardeners cultivated roses, violets, lilies, and forget-me-nots in careful rows. Florists sold them in small parcels, their scent sweet and precise. Young women learned to choose with intention. A crimson rose meant love, a white carnation symbolized purity, a yellow rose suggested jealousy, a violet whispered fidelity. Men delivered bouquets with trembling hands, trusting that the meaning would be understood. In a society that forbade overt emotion, the flowers spoke. Even grief had a language. Funerals were accompanied by wreaths and sprays whose colors and shapes encoded sorrow, respect, and remembrance. Black ribbons intertwined with white lilies. Forget-me-nots were tucked into hair or pinned to clothing. Mourners expressed the inexpressible, saying what could not be said aloud. Death, always near in Victorian life, found a voice in petals. The language of flowers extended into romance, its grammar subtle and exacting. Courtships were conducted in gardens, parlors, and lettered packages. A single camellia, white and perfect, could declare admiration. A bunch of primroses could hint at a secret longing. Every hand-delivered posy became a conversation, a dialogue without breach of propriety. In a world of social constraints, the flowers allowed young lovers to speak with honesty, though only the initiated could translate. And yet, it was also a tool of manipulation. A well-chosen bouquet could flatter, beguile, or intimidate. Women learned to wield it like a weapon, conveying both welcome and warning with nothing more than petals and stems. Men, ever careful, navigated these floral codes with the caution of spies, deciphering intentions hidden beneath perfume and color. Misreading a bloom could ruin a reputation, delay a proposal, or signal the wrong allegiance. In the subtlety of flowers, the power of society crystallized. Florists and writers codified the practice. The Language of Flowers, published in 1859, became a handbook of semiotics for the socially literate. Mothers taught daughters the meanings, passing knowledge from one generation to the next. A society obsessed with propriety discovered intimacy in a new form, private, coded, beautiful, and utterly human. Yet there was poetry in it as well. A bouquet left on a doorstep might carry love across distance, a message of comfort to the sick, or a signal of mourning where words could not travel. The flowers became the silent witnesses of human emotion, enduring where letters might be lost and conversation interrupted. They were small miracles, translating the inner world into form and scent. By the late Victorian era, the practice was nearly universal. Every season brought new blooms, every bouquet a declaration. In a world of restriction, where appearances often masked the truth, the language of flowers offered a gentle rebellion, a way to speak, to grieve, to love, and to be understood without a single word uttered aloud. The empire prided itself on progress and order, on railways and industry, on conquest and empire. Yet perhaps the most enduring testament of the era was not in steel or steam, but in petals, quietly encoding the human heart beneath the rigid protocols of Victorian life. The air itself seemed to vibrate with possibility. London, Manchester, Birmingham, cities thick with smoke and ambition, had become laboratories for the human mind. Inventors worked in workshops cluttered with gears, glass, and half-finished machines, their eyes bright with the fever of creation. Sparks flew from brass and steel, oil spilled across wooden floors, and the air was scented with sweat, metal, and hope. The Victorian century had discovered a new god, progress itself. From the humblest tinkerer to the most celebrated engineer, the age demanded ingenuity. Small, precise innovations accumulated into monumental change. Gas lighting transformed streets. The telegraph transformed communication. Steam engines transformed movement and labor. Each invention rippled outward, reshaping daily life, commerce, and empire. One could measure civilization not by kings or armies, but by the machines it produced. Electricity began to take its place beside steam as a force capable of shaping the world. Street lamps that flickered at dusk promised safety. Workshops glowed with energy once impossible to harness. Telegraph wires stretched across continents. And for the first time, distance was no barrier to connection. News, ideas, and commands traveled faster than any horse, and the empire's heartbeat quickened with every click and hum of its new instruments. Yet invention was not always gentle. The same steam that powered trains and factories could crush hands, arms, and lives. Boilers exploded without warning. Machines devoured the unprepared. In workshops, children learned the double lesson that brilliance required courage, and that courage often demanded suffering. For every marvel brought into the light, there was a shadow left in the alleys and cellars of the city laborers, bending to the whim of ingenuity, anonymous and uncredited. The Victorians were tireless in their obsession with improvement. Bicycles became a new symbol of freedom, typewriters a tool for women and clerks alike. Pneumatic tubes carried messages through the bowels of the city, and the first photographic cameras captured the world in astonishing detail. Every new invention was both a promise and a warning. Life could be transformed, but it could also be controlled. Efficiency became moral, speed became virtue, and the clock, more precise than ever, dictated the rhythm of civilization. Inventors themselves became celebrities. Names like Faraday, Edison, and Wheatstone were whispered with reverence in parlors and pubs alike. Their machines were symbols, their ideas talismans of possibility. Yet few understood the labor behind them, the apprentices who soldered, the draftsmen who sketched, the miners who extracted the metals, the factory girls who wound the thread of the telegraph's cables. Progress was never free. The age of invention transformed not only objects, but perception. The empire looked upon the world and saw it as a puzzle to solve, a system to improve. Nature was no longer wholly sacred. It was raw material, to be shaped by intellect and will. Cities expanded, economies surged, and the ordinary citizen felt the pulse of change in every new street lamp, every clock striking on the hour, every train arriving on time. By century's end, invention had become the currency of civilization. Britain prided itself not on conquest alone, but on creation, the transformation of ideas into reality, of science into everyday life. And yet, the price of this transformation remained invisible to most. Countless lives bent, broken, and reshaped in the shadow of every machine. The city hummed with the triumph of intellect, and in that hum, one could hear both the promise and the warning of the Victorian age, that progress, once unleashed, could reshape the world in ways both magnificent and merciless. The tables were set with precision. Polished silver gleamed beneath chandeliers heavy with crystal, each glass catching candlelight like a captured star. Platters of roast and pie, bowls of fruit, and delicate pastries glimmered as though spun from gold. In the dining rooms of Mayfair and Belgravia, the wealthy reclined in high-backed chairs, discussing literature, politics, and the empire's triumphs. Wine flowed in ruby streams, laughter echoed like music, and the servants moved silently, anticipating every gesture. The Victorians called it civilization, and beneath the floorboards, beyond the gilded walls, the city hungered. In the East End, families rose before dawn to tend to the factories or markets, their breakfast a crust of bread or nothing at all. Children were sent to beg, scavenge, or work, earning a few pence that would be divided among the household. Meat, sugar, and butter were luxuries that existed only in the imagination of the poor. The opulence of one world seemed to make the deprivation of the other sharper, more deliberate, a contrast that London had long learned to ignore. The disparity was visible in every street. Carriages passed over uneven cobblestones where men and women, bent with fatigue, carried coal, water, or goods for a fraction of the cost they generated. Markets overflowed with imported tea, spices, and sugar, while children scavenged for the scraps of yesterday's supper. The rich discussed the empire as though its victories were universal blessings, while the poor felt them only as burdens, taxes, conscriptions, and labor that never ended. And yet, hunger took many forms. It was not only the gnawing emptiness of the stomach, but the desire to ascend, to learn, to be seen. Apprentices in workshops endured hours of toil for the faint promise of upward mobility. Children in workhouses learned letters and numbers not out of curiosity, but as a key to survival. Every rationed meal, every shared crust, was a lesson in endurance. London's underclass had mastered survival as much as the wealthy had mastered display. The empire itself feasted upon this contrast. Cotton fields in India and America fed the mills of Manchester. Tea and sugar flowed from distant colonies, sustaining opulent lives in London drawing rooms. Ships carried wealth east and west, while famine, disease, and deprivation remained homegrown, invisible to those who lived among the comforts. Each bite taken by the elite was subsidized by labor that remained unseen, unheard, uncounted. Even in the arts, this tension appeared. Painting celebrated abundance, while novels and journalism chronicled poverty. Dickens wrote of the hungry in alleys. Painters captured feasts in gilded halls. The contrast was deliberate, unavoidable, a reminder that the empire's success depended upon inequality, that wealth was measured not just in coin, but in the deprivation it concealed. By nightfall, the city pulsed with dual rhythms, the laughter and clink of glasses above, the silent shuffle and cough of hunger below. The streets of London carried the scent of roast and coal, perfume and sweat, opulence and deprivation, all in one. In the end, the Victorian century would remember its triumphs: railways, inventions, palaces, colonies, but it would also remember the hunger that lay beneath them, a quiet, enduring reminder that civilization's light shines brightest when its shadows are deepest. The empire had achieved greatness, yes, but it was a greatness paid for in the silent hunger of millions whose names would never appear in the ledgers of history. The parlor was dim, lit only by the flicker of candles that trembled against the draughts slipping through sash windows. Chairs were arranged in a circle, hands placed lightly upon the table. The air was heavy with the scent of wax, smoke, and the faint perfume of anxiety. Outside, London moved in its usual clamor, but inside, time seemed to slow, bending toward the invisible. The Victorians had begun to speak with ghosts. Spiritualism had arrived quietly, at first a novelty, a pastime for the bored wealthy. But as the century progressed, it became obsession. Mediums claimed to channel the dead, tables tapped in response, and chairs tilted as if moved by unseen hands. Messages arrived in code, letters from beyond the grave. Families sought comfort, curiosity, or proof that life extended beyond the finite. and in every candlelit room, a flicker of hope mingled with fear. For many, it was more than entertainment. Loss was constant in Victorian life. Cholera, typhus, industrial, accidents, famine, and war had hollowed neighborhoods. Children died before adulthood. Mothers mourned husbands before their hair had turned grey. Spiritualists promised connection, a whispered voice, a moving object, a certainty that those who had passed were still present. The appeal was universal. The empire could command oceans and railways, conquer continents, yet it could not command death. The séances were performed with ceremony. Mediums, dressed in black or violet, instructed participants to clear their minds, to focus on those absent. Candles flickered, cards and charms were laid out, and every sound became significant. A creak of the floor, a gust of wind, a tapping of the table, all were interpreted as messages from the beyond. The living listened intently, fearing disbelief as much as hoping for proof. In the newspapers, these gatherings inspired fascination and ridicule alike. Scientific journals dismissed them as superstition. Caricaturists mocked them in ink, satire. Yet public interest only grew. The wealthy and the middle class alike attended lectures, demonstrations, and parlors devoted entirely to contacting the dead. Some saw fraud, others felt miracles. In a century obsessed with control of labor, of time, of empire, spiritualism offered a glimpse of the uncontrollable, the soul, the unknown, the eternal. Spiritualism also intersected with reform. Women, often excluded from formal power, became mediums, gaining influence through perceived connection to the otherworldly. They presided over circles, dictated the interpretation of messages, and commanded attention in a society that otherwise silenced them. In subtle ways, the dead lent authority to the living, and Victorian women learned to wield it. Yet not all messages were comforting. Some brought warnings, others despair. Grief could be exploited. Families clung to every knock or tilt of the table as evidence, sometimes mistaking coincidence for intent. Still, the need for certainty was greater than the need for reason. Spiritualism flourished in the tension between doubt and hope, between fear and longing. By the end of the century, spiritualism had become an institution, part religion, part entertainment, part science. It reflected a society wrestling with mortality, morality, and the limits of knowledge. In homes and parlors across London, the living and the dead conversed in silence, carried on whispers, and tapped out their presence in the faintest vibrations. For the Victorians, it was a reminder. The empire could measure, map, and mechanize the world, yet it could not capture the most vital force of all the human spirit, restless, questioning, and longing beyond the veil. The empire's strength was measured not only in its armies, but in the quiet efficiency of its reach. Across continents, from the plains of India to the jungles of Africa, the machinery of control hummed with relentless precision. It was not always steel or steam, though those were indispensable, but law, taxation, and bureaucracy, applied with the same care as an engineer tracing blueprints. Every colony became a cog, every officer and clerk a gear in the vast machine of empire. In India, the British administration had perfected its network. Railways carried troops and goods across thousands of miles. Telegraphs transmitted orders before the ink on letters could dry, and census takers counted populations with meticulous accuracy. Governors issued instructions, district officers enforced them, and the local population learned quickly that the machinery of governance did not pause for custom, tradition, or dissent. Each order reinforced the invisible lines that divided the spot, rulers from the ruled, threading authority into every village and city. Trade flowed like the blood of the empire. Cotton from the fields of Bengal, tea from Assam, indigo from Madras, all moved along meticulously charted routes. Ships sailed from Calcutta and Bombay, passing through Suez, arriving in Liverpool or London, their cargoes transformed into wealth that sustained the metropole. Every bale, crate, or barrel was a testament to the efficiency of the colonial machine, yet behind every shipment lay the labor of millions who remained largely invisible to the empire's benefactors. Africa presented its own challenges. Rivers and jungles resisted the cartographer's pen. Disease claimed the unwary. Terrain slowed armies, and local kingdoms negotiated, resisted, or fell. Yet the British adapted, building forts, roads, and stations, applying law and education to bend distant lands toward their control. Surveyors measured, engineers leveled, and missionaries followed, translating religion into regulation. Each step was calculated, part of a grand design that sought to knit together lands thousands of miles apart into a single, obedient system. Colonial officers lived in a world of dualities. They wrote reports in perfect English, outlining progress in statistics, expenditures, and crop yields, while witnessing firsthand the suffering and resistance of the people they ruled. Their diaries, often hidden, never published, tell a different story. Exhaustion, fear, and the moral weight of overseeing lives without consent. The machine ran because humans pushed its gears, but those same humans were exhausted by the relentless pace of empire. Even within the colonies, the system demanded compliance from its own officers. Promotions, pensions, and privileges were contingent on performance. Letters were scrutinized, reports audited, and obedience rewarded above innovation or mercy. Discipline was the lubricant that kept the wheels turning. Any deviation, too, much sympathy. Too little attention could stall an entire district, compromise trade, or invite revolt. Yet, the machine was never perfect. Epidemics spread faster than engineers could build hospitals, droughts ruined crops despite meticulous record-keeping, and rebellion often arrived unexpectedly, forcing rapid recalibration. Every failure reminded the empire of its dependence on both human and mechanical precision, of the fragility beneath its apparent omnipotence. By the late 19th century, the colonial machine had become a marvel, vast, complex, and terrifying in its scope. It fed Britain's wealth, powered its industry, and projected its influence across the globe. But it did so at an incalculable cost: the subjugation of millions, the transformation of societies, the shaping of lives that would be remembered only in fragments. In its silence, the empire hummed a machine both magnificent and merciless, whose gears were forged from ambition, intelligence, and the unotherlos, quiet endurance of those caught within its reach. And through it all, the world learned that power could be engineered, that control could be systematic, and that even the smallest cog might change the course of history. The fields lay empty, and the wind carried the smell of loss. In the west of Ireland, the summer sun revealed what the heart had long suspected. The potato crops had failed again, the blight sweeping through the land like a silent predator. Villages were silent, save for the coughs of children, the groans of the elderly, and the occasional bark of dogs scavenging for scraps. The country had always endured hardship, but this year, the suffering would be unimaginable. For decades, Ireland had been tethered to an empire that demanded profit above life. Landlords collected rent from tenants who barely survived, the famine only deepening as fields were cleared to feed the distant cities of England. Ships carried grain across the sea even as the people starved, and officials measured statistics instead of bodies. The empire's bureaucracy counted crops, debts, and ships, but not the hollow eyes of children or the hollowed stomachs of mothers. Families fled when they could, gathering whatever belongings they could carry, and walking for miles across muddy roads. Some boarded overcrowded ships bound for Liverpool, Boston, or New York, hoping for survival in lands that promised anonymity but could not erase trauma. Others stayed, too weak to move, hoping only to live until the next day. Disease accompanied famine like a shadow: typhus, dysentery, cholera, each one a whisper that death could not be delayed. In Dublin, London, and the drawing rooms of England, the famine was a subject of debate. Newspapers reported on it, ministers spoke of relief, but action was slow and often insufficient. Public sympathy collided with political expediency. The empire feared encouraging Irish independence, feared the cost of aid, feared acknowledging the full scale of suffering. Relief came in measures too small, too late, or through institutions unprepared to handle the human tide. And yet, amid the despair, resilience appeared. Communities shared what little they had. Neighbors carried water to the weak, sheltered the homeless, and buried those who died in secret, to preserve dignity where the world offered none. Priests, teachers, and local leaders became lifelines, navigating both British oversight and the fury of the famine to save lives wherever possible. Each act of survival was a quiet defiance, a testament to endurance when the empire had turned its back. The shadow of famine stretched far beyond the immediate deaths. Generations were scarred, populations reduced, culture displaced. The exodus reshaped cities across the Atlantic, leaving empty houses, abandoned villages, and a sorrow that lingered in every valley and field. Ireland's loss became Britain's profit, yet the moral reckoning never arrived. The empire celebrated its industrial might, even as its neighbor starved. Photographs, sketches, and newspaper reports attempted to document the horror, but images could not capture the silence of the fields, the hunger in children's eyes, or the quiet resignation of the old. Survivors carried stories, passed in hushed tones, and in those stories, memory became resistance. The famine's shadow would last for decades, a reminder that progress for some could be devastation for others. By the time the crisis waned, Ireland had been transformed. Families were scattered, lands depopulated, the culture bruised but unbroken. The empire had endured, its cities wealthy, its industries thriving, but the famine lingered like a spectre, a lesson in the cost of indifference, a testament to the resilience of those who survived in the shadow of starvation. The land itself seemed to remember, whispering the names of the lost whenever the wind blew across the empty fields. The fog rolled in thick and silent, wrapping London in a grey suffocation that made the city both familiar and alien. Street lamps flickered in its thickness, casting golden orbs that trembled and wavered as though unsure whether to exist at all. Horse hooves echoed hollowly, footfalls were muffled, and from the alleys came whispers that seemed to linger longer than their speakers. It was the London of the 1880s, a city alive with smoke, shadow, and fear, the perfect stage for a darkness that walked on two legs. The people called him Jack, or, when the terror was spoken of in hushed tones, Jack the Ripper. He moved through the East End like a myth made flesh, invisible and relentless, leaving behind only the evidence of his work. The bodies of women, cruelly murdered, mutilated, abandoned in the same streets that had swallowed the voices of the poor for decades. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Aldgate became theatres of dread, their fog acting as both curtain, accomplice. The air smelled faintly of coal, refuse, and something fouler, something that had no name. The city had long been accustomed to suffering. Cholera, hunger, and industrial accidents had made the East End resilient in ways that were invisible to the wealthy. But Jack changed the rules. He introduced a fear that was deliberate, personal, and intimate. Mothers clutched their daughters as they walked the alleys at night. Men ran their hands along walls as they returned from work, eyes darting for shadows that might conceal a figure, a knife, a monster. The Ripper's presence was both everywhere and nowhere, a haunting that the fog itself seemed to amplify. Newspapers fueled the panic. Headlines screamed and speculated, drawing attention to the crime while simultaneously mocking the authorities' inability to catch the killer. Detectives poured over the streets, their boots clattering against cobblestones, lanterns swinging, notebooks filling with observations that led nowhere. Letters arrived claiming to be from Jack, signed with terror and irony. Some believed, some dismissed. The city's imagination was as much a participant in the killings as the man himself. The victims were women, often poor, often overlooked. They were the invisible lives of London prostitutes, servants, women forced to navigate streets that were dangerous long before Jack arrived. Their anonymity made them targets, but it also made their deaths both symbolic and horrifying. The Empire's failure to protect its own, the fragility of existence beneath the gaslight and steam. For every body discovered, hundreds more went unnoticed, surviving in the shadows but living under the weight of threat and despair. Despite the horror, London continued. The factories roared, carriages clattered, the Thames exhaled its smoke and filth, and life pressed forward. But the East End itself became a cautionary place, a liminal world where light met shadow, where survival demanded vigilance, and where the line between myth and man blurred. Jack the Ripper would never be fully identified. The fog carried his name, his legend, and his silence alike. In every alley, every gaslit corner, every shadowed street, the city remembered him not only as a killer, but as a reflection of the darkness that thrived in the gaps of society, in the hunger, the poverty, the neglect, and the unseen lives that had always filled London's alleys. The streets of Jack and Fog became both symbol and reality. They were the places where the Empire's progress, wealth, and innovation collided with the raw, unfiltered human suffering it could never entirely erase. And in that collision, London learned a lesson it would never forget, that darkness is never absent where shadows are allowed to flourish. She pedaled through the streets before the dawn had fully broken, her skirts hitched just enough to clear the bicycle's frame, the wind tugging at her hair. In 1870s London, this was not merely a ride, it was rebellion. The bicycle, newly popular, became the symbol of independence, of possibility, of a world that had begun to bend to women's will. With each turn of the wheel, the modern woman claimed a space that society had once denied her. For centuries, women had been constrained, their movements, their choices, their very lives circumscribed by the invisible rules of propriety. Education was limited, employment opportunities narrower still. The angel in the house was the ideal, gentle, obedient, decorative, and silent. But the industrial age, with all its change and expansion, began to loosen these bonds. Women became teachers, nurses, writers, and eventually engineers of their own destinies, moving against centuries of expectation with quiet determination. The bicycle was merely the beginning. It allowed women mobility, a sense of agency, and a glimpse of the world beyond domestic walls. They rode to work, to lectures, to literary societies. They could visit friends, markets, and parks without a chaperone, reclaiming streets that had long been the domain of men. With mobility came freedom, and with freedom came questions that demanded answers about education, labor, and eventually, suffrage. Typewriters followed the bicycle. Offices began to hire women to manage correspondence, filing, and clerical tasks. It was a modest beginning, but one that taught independence, financial management, and efficiency. Women discovered that skill could equal power, and that power could be exercised without violence. Literacy and numeracy became tools of liberation, just as mobility had been. And still, obstacles abounded. Society's rules were persistent. Critics mocked the bicycle as dangerous, indecent, or frivolous. Clerks were limited to the lowest-paying positions. For every opportunity opened, social pressures attempted to close a dozen more. Yet women persisted, learning to navigate the restrictions with patience and ingenuity. They joined societies that promoted education, temperance, and political awareness, training themselves for roles long denied. Victorian literature both reflected and fueled this transformation. Novels depicted women navigating public life, challenging expectations, and negotiating the balance between ambition and propriety. Writers like George Eliot and Elizabeth Gaskell provided models of intellect and independence, offering examples to a generation that had long been told that their proper sphere ended at the hearth. By the end of the century, the modern woman had begun to emerge fully from the shadows. She was visible in classrooms, in offices, on bicycles, and in the pages of newspapers and journals. She spoke in meetings, organized reform movements, and campaigned for rights long denied. Her independence was partial, her power incomplete, but it was undeniable. The empire itself began to feel the effects. Women who once existed only as ornaments were becoming citizens in practice, even if not yet in law. Their presence transformed public life, redefined labor, and challenged the moral and cultural assumptions that had governed society for centuries. And so the modern woman rode forward through streets, offices, and lecture halls alike, claiming space, voice, and vision. The Victorian age, with all its inventions, wealth, and progress, had given her tools. She would shape them into instruments of change. In the turn of a wheel, the strike of a key, and the courage to speak, she began to map the course of a century yet to come. The light glinted off the glass like a fragile promise. The Crystal Palace, relocated from Hyde Park to Sydenham, rose again in 1854, its arches gleaming in the sun, its walls reflecting centuries of ambition, innovation, and vanity. It was a cathedral of human ingenuity, a monument to an empire that believed it could harness both nature and culture, bending them into perfection. Inside, machines whirred, inventions dazzled, and visitors walked beneath a ceiling that seemed almost to float, supported only by the faith of its engineers. The exhibition halls were alive. Mechanical models spun in precise circles, telegraphs buzzed with distant messages, and steam engines exhaled clouds that blurred the boundaries between the real and the imagined. Foreign dignitaries and British elites mingled with curiosity seekers, all drawn by the spectacle of a civilization at its peak. The Crystal Palace was more than glass and iron. It was an assertion, a declaration that human skill could capture the world and present it in perfect symmetry. But the brilliance was deceptive. The light that dazzled so brightly also cast deep shadows. Beyond the palace, the empire's inequities continued unchallenged. Factories hummed, child labor persisted, and London's streets remained thick with smoke and soot. The palace celebrated achievement, but it could not erase the cost, the suffering of those whose labor had powered the empire, whose hands had polished the metal and wound the machinery that filled the halls with motion and sound. The people marveled without understanding. Children pressed their noses to glass, watching the marvels inside while their own futures were uncertain, bound by class, gender, and circumstance. Parents spoke of progress in tones of pride and fear. Every display, every invention, every gilded artifact was both inspiration and indictment, a reminder that civilization could ascend without necessarily lifting everyone along with it. Then came the fire. In 1836, decades later, the palace succumbed to flames, the glass and iron glowing red against the night. The fire tore through halls that had once celebrated triumph, consuming inventions, models, and exhibits alike. Sparks rained down like molten stars, and the smell of burning wood and melting iron filled the air. Visitors and workers watched helplessly, knowing that what had once seemed eternal could be undone in a single night. The destruction was more than physical. It symbolized the fragility of human ambition, the impermanence of even the grandest achievements. The empire itself, for all its might, could not control fire, decay, or accident. The palace, so carefully engineered to display perfection, had fallen to the same forces that shaped the rest of the world: time, neglect, and inevitability. Yet from the ashes came reflection. Engineers, architects, and planners studied the ruins, learning from their collapse. The lessons of the fire shaped building codes, urban planning, and safety protocols for decades to come. The Crystal Palace, though gone, remained a blueprint in the minds of the empire, a testament to both aspiration and humility. The empire celebrated its victories, yet the memory of fire lingered. It reminded the Victorians that even in brilliance, fragility resides, that even monuments of glass and iron are subject to the impermanence that governs all human endeavor. And so, The palace's light, though extinguished, continued to illuminate the truths of a civilization capable of astonishing achievement, yet never beyond the reach of destruction. The first flicker was subtle, almost shy, yet it carried the promise of a new era. In the 1880s, London began to hum with electricity. Gas lamps, steady and golden, still illuminated the streets, but a new light emerged, brighter, sharper, more exacting. Arc lights glowed above factories, streets, and squares, casting a pale brilliance that did not waver with the wind or the fog. The electric night had arrived, and it would not only illuminate but transform the very rhythm of life. In factories, the change was immediate, no longer constrained by the dim, uneven glow of gas. Machines could run longer, with greater precision and efficiency. Workers' hands moved beneath unflinching light, and engineers observed every detail of their mechanisms with clarity impossible before. Productivity increased, hours extended, the industrial heartbeat grew faster, louder, more relentless. Efficiency was worshipped, and the empire, powered by steam and now electricity, seemed unstoppable. The streets themselves became theaters of wonder. Arc lamps lined roads, casting harsh shadows that danced against cobblestones. Carriages moved beneath their glare, pedestrians no longer fearing the hidden corners that gaslight had once left in uncertainty. Shops displayed their wares in brilliance, fabrics, jewelry, and glass, each sparkle exaggerated by electric glow. Londoners marveled at the spectacle, seeing their familiar city in a new, almost alien form. Night, once the refuge of mystery, was now open, exposed, and alive. Electricity transformed domestic life as well. Homes began to adopt the new light, initially in small doses, a single lamp in a parlor or a hall, then larger, more confident installations. Families could read into the night, write letters, and conduct business without reliance on flickering flames. The hearth, once the center of domestic illumination, was supplemented and in some cases replaced by wires carrying power from unseen generators, humming softly beneath the floors. Yet progress brought tension. The infrastructure was experimental, dangerous, and expensive. Generators were prone to explosions, wires frayed, and accidental electrocution claimed lives in its earliest years. Insurers hesitated. Legislators debated safety standards. Still, the electric night spread, unstoppable in ambition and allure. Its adoption became a mark of sophistication, of modernity, a visual demonstration that the age of invention was no longer theoretical but absolute. In the theaters, electricity reshaped spectacle. Performances could extend into hours previously impossible without candlelight. Stagecraft gained new tools, lights that shifted color, intensity, and focus, painting drama across actors' faces and scenery with precision. Audiences sat in awe beneath a canopy of artificial dawn, unaware that their city, too, had become a stage. By the century's close, the electric night was everywhere. Streets, factories, offices, and homes pulsed with a new rhythm, a rhythm faster and sharper than any steam engine. The fog seemed thinner under the glare, the shadows more defined, the city itself more confident, more conscious of its own power. Yet the glow carried more than illumination. It carried expectation, surveillance, and exhaustion. The empire's machinery moved faster. Its citizens moved faster. Rest became measured, time accounted for, activity mandated. The electric night did not merely show the world, it transformed it, marking the dawn of a society that would never sleep as it had before. And in that light, London discovered both triumph and vulnerability. A metropolis bright, alive, and unstoppable, yet more exposed, more human, and more fragile than ever before. The century had learned to bend night to its will, and in doing so, revealed that the true power of progress was as luminous as it was relentless. The sun never set, the newspapers boasted, and perhaps for the first time in human history, it was nearly true. By the 1890s, the British Empire stretched across the globe, from the frozen reaches of Canada to the deserts of Africa, from the jungles of India to the distant islands of the Pacific. Its colonies, protectorates, and dominions shimmered like a constellation of red dots on the maps in Westminster, each one a node in a network of commerce, law, and administration. London's heart beat in synchrony with faraway cities, connected by rail, telegraph, and steamship. The empire was a machine in motion, vast and confident, its power both celebrated and feared. At the Queen's Diamond Jubilee in 1897, this power was displayed with ceremonial precision. Troops marched in formation, their polished boots striking the ground with rhythm that echoed through the streets. Flags flew, soldiers saluted, and dignitaries from across the empire lined the streets, presenting gifts, loyalty, and homage. The crowds cheered for their monarch, for the empire, for an idea that seemed larger than life itself. Banners proclaimed achievement, unity, and stability. And for a moment, the world seemed captured in London's light. The empire's wealth was visible in every corner of the city. Railways carried goods harvested, mined, or manufactured in distant lands, feeding London's markets and warehouses. Harbours overflowed with cargo tea, cotton, spices, gold, and opium, the material proof of a civilization at its zenith. Factories hummed, office buildings towered, and department stores displayed goods from every corner of the globe, transforming consumption into spectacle. Industry, innovation, and labor had created a metropolis of almost dizzying abundance. But this grandeur rested upon invisible labor and quiet suffering. In India, fields grew crops that left the local population malnourished. In Africa, mines extracted resources that enriched London while communities were displaced. The colonies sent soldiers and administrators, enforcing laws that favored empire over people. Back home, the working classes in Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham powered the machinery of progress, their lives measured by shifts and wages, their sacrifices absorbed into the empire's success without acknowledgement. For all the splendor, the empire's foundation was not only ambition but exploitation. At home, the empire inspired culture, education, and science. Museums displayed artifacts from every continent. Universities trained men and women to serve abroad. Explorers mapped deserts, rivers, and jungles with painstaking precision. Literature, newspapers, and journals celebrated triumphs, catalogued discoveries, and offered the illusion of control over both nature and human endeavor. The empire was not merely territorial, it was intellectual, moral, and ideological, a vision projected in every classroom, lecture hall, and gallery. Yet even at its height, the empire was vulnerable. Rebellions smoldered in colonies, unrest simmered in cities, and the rapid pace of industrialization strained resources and society alike. Diplomacy, military action, and administration constantly balanced achievement against chaos. The grandeur of parade and ceremony masked an ever-present fragility that the same network that sustained power could unravel if mismanaged or challenged. By the close of the 19th century, Britain had achieved its apogee. Its influence was unparalleled, its economy dominant, its culture exported across oceans, but the brilliance of the empire was inseparable from its contradictions, wealth and deprivation, triumph and exploitation, spectacle and suffering. The Diamond Jubilee illuminated not only the reach of British power but the shadows that sustained it, a reminder that every empire, no matter how vast, rests on a foundation as fragile as human ambition itself. The streets of London were alive with contradictions. Gaslight and electric glow mingled with the fog, casting the city in hues both dazzling and oppressive. In Mayfair, ladies in silk and satin promenaded under chandeliers, their laughter ringing like crystal. A mile away, in Whitechapel, children scurried along muddy alleys, scavenging for scraps to stave off hunger. The empire celebrated progress, invention, and wealth, yet the shadows of poverty, disease, and neglect were never far behind. This was the Victorian Age, an era of brilliance and decay, morality and hypocrisy, ambition and exploitation. Education promised enlightenment, yet literacy remained uneven. Public schools taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, yet many children still labored in factories, mines, and fields. Knowledge was a key, but access to it was determined by class, gender, and geography. Women learned to read and write, yet their opportunities for employment, autonomy, and political participation were still limited. Men might study science and literature, but the streets below reminded them daily of inequality, of hunger, and of labor that went unrewarded. The empire itself thrived on paradox. It claimed to bring civilization to the colonies while enforcing laws that maintained control through coercion. India's railways carried troops and commerce, yet famine stalked fields that fed distant markets. Africa's resources filled London warehouses, yet communities were displaced and subjected to violence. Britain's moral and cultural authority was projected globally, but domestically, factories poisoned lungs, sewers overflowed, and slums grew denser. Progress was measured in wealth, not in well-being. Science and faith collided in uneasy harmony. Darwin challenged creation, Pasteur revealed invisible killers, and medicine advanced by leaps while mortality remained high among the poor. Hospitals were cleaned, surgeries performed under anesthesia, yet sanitation crises like the Great Stink and cholera epidemics reminded the city that knowledge alone could not conquer nature or neglect. People prayed for health, while engineers and doctors attempted to enforce it, an era where reason and belief, empirical evidence and superstition coexisted uneasily. Morality, too, was contested. The upper classes preached virtue, charity, and propriety, yet profited from industries that exploited labor, colonies, and even addiction. Opium trade, cotton plantations, and factory production enriched the few while the many suffered. Philanthropy coexisted with neglect. Reform movements sought justice, yet political and social structures often obstructed them. Crime and punishment, wealth and deprivation, privilege and suffering, all were intertwined in a web that seemed both natural and unjust. Even culture reflected this duality. Theaters staged comedies while the city starved. Literature celebrated virtue while depicting vice. Photography froze both beauty and decay, leaving posterity to witness the contradictions of an age that glorified achievement but tolerated inequity. Art, invention, and empire flourished alongside disease, death, and exploitation. The Victorian mind, accustomed to rules, systems, and order, now navigated a world of inconsistency where ideals rarely matched reality. By the century's close, the contradictions were undeniable. Britain had achieved wealth, innovation, and global influence unparalleled in history. Yet it had done so on a foundation of inequality, labor, and moral compromise. The empire could measure success in railways, factories, and colonies, but the price was measured in hunger, sickness, and disillusionment. Every triumph bore the shadow of a failure. Every candle of progress cast a longer, darker shade. The Victorian age, brilliant and flawed, was defined by these contrasts. A civilization that soared with ingenuity, yet stumbled in conscience. An empire that illuminated the world while leaving vast swaths of it in shadow. And within those shadows, the city remembered everything. The hunger, the labor, the grief, and the quiet endurance that made it all possible. The palace was quiet in a way London rarely permitted itself to be. Outside, the city hummed with commerce, with the clatter of carriages, with the distant whistle of trains, yet within the walls of Buckingham, time seemed to fold in upon itself. The year was 1901, and the Queen, who had ruled for more than 6 decades, lay at the threshold of history. Victoria, the empress of an empire that stretched across continents, whose image had been printed and painted in thousands of homes, whose policies and presence had shaped an era, was fading, Her life had been defined by contrasts: power and humility, duty and desire, wealth and grief. She had ascended to the throne at 18, a young girl guided by ministers, now an old woman whose hand had steadied a nation through triumph, rebellion, famine, and war. She had witnessed the empire expand, technology advance, and society change in ways her predecessors could not have imagined. And yet, in this quiet room, she was as vulnerable as any of the people who had labored in the streets, the factories, or the colonies to sustain the world she governed. Around her bed, attendants whispered in hushed tones. Doctors, long accustomed to her health's fluctuations, watched silently, noting every breath, every pulse. Courtiers lingered near doorways, careful not to intrude, yet anxious to witness the end of an era. For the first time in decades, the Queen was no longer the ruler. She was simply human, frail, exhausted, and mortal. Outside, London waited, unaware of the exact moment when a century would tilt on its axis. Her reign had been marked by innovation as much as it had been by tradition. Steam engines had begun to hum when she was still a girl. Electric light illuminated the streets in her later years. Railways connected the empire, the telegraph transmitted its messages, and in distant colonies, administrators followed the patterns she had overseen from her palace. And yet, for all the machinery of empire, for all the power of governance, there remained the human element, the loyalty, the grief, the devotion, and the quiet endurance that sustained every triumph. Her last days were filled with reflection, as those closest to her read letters, recounted achievements, and tried to prepare for a transition that had been anticipated for years. She thought of Albert, gone nearly 40 years, and the shadow his death had cast over her personal life. She thought of her children, scattered across Europe and the empire, of the soldiers and subjects she had never met, but whose lives were bound to hers. Her mind, still sharp in spite of frailty, catalogued decades of progress, sorrow, and resilience, the cumulative memory of a world transformed under her gaze. When Victoria drew her final breath, it was quiet, almost imperceptible, yet it resonated like the toll of a distant bell. The empire mourned, but it also paused, for the century she had defined had ended with her. The streets of London, the palaces abroad, the colonies from Canada to India, all acknowledged that the world had been reshaped by one life. Not all of it had been perfect, not all of it fair, but it had been profound. Her death marked more than the end of a life. It was the closing of a chapter in history. The empire inherited the momentum she had built, the machinery of industry, the global connections, the ideals, yet it also inherited the contradictions, the inequities, and the shadows that had defined her age. Victoria's last breath was both an ending and a beginning, a reminder that even in the greatest empires, the human heart remains the fulcrum upon which history pivots. And as the light faded in her room, London itself seemed to pause for a moment, gaslight and electric glow mingling in the streets, as if acknowledging that the century's life force had moved on. The city exhaled as though it had learned to breathe through centuries of coal and ambition. London, sprawling and relentless, remained a monument to the triumphs and contradictions of the Victorian age. Smoke hung in the air like a memory, curling from chimneys, factories, and furnaces, tracing invisible patterns across streets, bridges, and alleys. The scent was familiar, bitter, acrid, yet intoxicating in its constancy. It was the inheritance of a century that had burned, innovated, and expanded itself into a world it could barely contain. Every street told a story. The narrow alleys of Whitechapel whispered of poverty and labor, of children who had worked before dawn and slept in straw-strewn corners by night. The factories that once roared with unceasing power still stood, their iron frames shining beneath the occasional glow of a modern electric lamp. The mills had built the empire, fueled its wealth, and yet they had also carried its cost, the lives of the invisible, the wages of the exploited, the quiet endurance of those who labored without recognition. Above them, the city's wealth shimmered. Mayfair's townhouses glimmered with polished brass, crystal chandeliers, and carpets woven with patterns from across the empire. London's docks continued to hum with commerce, goods from India, Africa, and the Americas flowing in as effortlessly as the Thames carried its waters. Railways threaded the empire together, telegraph wires connected continents, and the industrial machine continued its unrelenting rhythm. The empire's brilliance was undeniable, tangible, and immortalized in glass, steel, and stone. Yet the smoke remained, not just the literal smoke from coal fires and engines, but the figurative smoke of contradictions, inequities, and compromises. Progress had been built on the suffering of the poor, the subjugation of colonies, and the invisibility of countless lives. Hospitals had been cleaned, streets illuminated, and railways laid, yet disease, hunger, and exploitation lingered in the corners of memory. The smoke was the residue of ambition, the scent of what had been sacrificed for brilliance, a reminder that civilization could rise only with a shadow beneath it. The inheritance was also intellectual. Science had flourished, mapping the heavens, dissecting the body, and measuring the earth. Inventions, bicycles, typewriters, electric lamps had redefined daily life. Literature chronicled the human condition, both its virtues and its cruelty. Newspapers, photography, and journals documented triumph and tragedy alike. The Victorian age had left behind a world of knowledge, tools, and reflection, demanding that the next generation interpret, apply, and reconcile it. And socially, the inheritance was profound. Women had begun to claim education, employment, and independence. Reformers had challenged injustice and laid foundations for equality. The underclasses had survived, endured, and, in some cases, begun to assert themselves in ways unimagined decades before. The empire's strength was now intertwined with its contradictions, its achievements inseparable from the human cost it exacted. As the century faded into the 20th, London remained luminous yet fragile, powerful yet haunted. The smoke drifted over the Thames and through the streets, a living reminder of all that had been achieved and all that had been lost. It was a legacy of ingenuity and endurance, of brilliance and burden, a century distilled into the haze that hung above the city, like a promise and a warning. The Victorian age had ended, but its inheritance persisted, in the smoke that filled the streets, in the rails that carried commerce across continents, in the knowledge, culture, and contradictions left behind. The world had been transformed, and London, forever marked by ambition and shadow alike, exhaled slowly, as though acknowledging that the age's light and its darkness were now inseparable.